and a momentous day for a magnificent man.
Happy birthday to you.
The world celebrates Captain Tom Moore.
Your heroic efforts have lifted the spirits of the entire nation.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with what we know about the crash of a Canadian military helicopter off the coast of Greece. The families of 6 Canadians got the terrible news today that helicopter went down while on a training mission. 1 person is confirmed dead. The search is continuing for 5 others. They are Sub-Lieutenant Matthew Pike, a naval weapons officer from Nova Scotia. Captain Brendan Ian MacDonald, a pilot also from Nova Scotia. Captain Kevin Hagan from BC, also a pilot. Air Combat Systems Officer Captain Maxime Miron-Morin from Quebec, and Master Corporal Matthew Cousins, an airborne electronic sensor operator from Ontario. And Sub-Lieutenant Abigail Cobra is confirmed to have died. The 23-year-old from Nova Scotia was a member of the Royal Canadian Navy. Her father said in a Facebook post, he is shattered knowing we won't have this smile in our lives anymore. She loved her job, her life, and most of all, her friends and family. It is not clear what happened. The military says the helicopter went down in the Ionian Sea yesterday as it was returning to HMCS Fredericton. The flight data and voice recorders have been recovered, and an intense search is underway for the missing. All of this has added another layer of agony to Nova Scotia. Ross Lord is in Halifax with our top story tonight.
Friends and family say Abigail Cobra was a credit to her community and her country. Better known as Abby, she was a young Navy sailor and accomplished 23-year-old musician active in her Nova Scotia church.
She was excellent on the bagpipes, compassionate in everything she did.
Last week, Sub-Lieutenant Cobra performed a musical tribute on board HMCS Fredericton, honoring the 22 victims of the Nova Scotia mass shooting.
She did that from the forecastle of the Fredericton while deployed for everybody in Nova Scotia. And here we are only 2 short days later paying that tribute back to her. It just doesn't seem right.
There were 5 other people on the Cyclone helicopter that crashed off the coast of Greece.
Each of them will leave a void that cannot be filled. On behalf of all Canadians, I want to offer my deepest support to their families, their friends, their shipmates, and their fellow CAF members. This is another very hard day for Halifax, for Nova Scotia, and for our armed forces families.
The chopper, with the military call sign Stalker, was returning to HMCS Fredericton during a training exercise before sundown.
At approximately 6:52 p.m., the ship lost contact with the aircrew, and a few minutes later, flares were spotted in the water.
The military calls the crash an accident.
We remain in contact with Italy, Greece, the United States, and Turkey, who are assisting us in the search and rescue efforts to help us find the Canadian Armed Forces members who are on the helicopter.
Water temperatures in the search area are much warmer than they are here in the North Atlantic, but a pilot who's flown military choppers in the Mediterranean says there are other complications.
The Ionian Basin is the deepest portion of the Mediterranean, which can pose a problem if the aircraft has gone to the bottom. Is going to be an issue with locating where the wreckage is, and also perhaps any recovery are going to be hampered by the depth.
The entire fleet of cyclones on the east and west coast has been placed on an operational pause, which means the choppers will not fly anywhere until the military rules out any fleet-wide problem. Ross Lord, Global News, Halifax.
The Sikorsky Cyclone helicopter has been in use by the Canadian Armed Forces since 2018. It replaced the 50-year-old Sea Kings. The Cyclones were originally ordered in 2004, but the multi-billion-dollar program was plagued by years of delays and cost overruns. They have been deployed on 5 overseas missions with the Navy and used for surveillance, search and rescue, and tactical transport for operations supporting national and international security efforts. They are praised for their state-of-the-art technology.
I don't have any concerns about the helicopter. It's performed terrifically. It's got 9,000 hours on the fleet. We've had one other incident, which was a hard landing a little while ago, but that was because of a very unusual gust of wind that knocked the helicopter around.
The helicopter and HMCS Fredericton were halfway through a 6-month deployment to help NATO keep Russia from interfering with European security. As military families grieve, members of the armed forces are doing critical work, keeping people in long-term care homes alive. More teams of soldiers are being deployed to Quebec nursing homes. The expanded operation means soldiers will be helping in up to 20 Quebec care homes within the next few weeks. Quebec first asked for military help in 5 overwhelmed facilities earlier this month. The virus, though, kept spreading, and the crisis is now much worse. The province says 280 care homes are now dealing with outbreaks, and 4,400 residents are confirmed to be infected. One of the hardest hit facilities in Quebec is the St. Dorothée Public Long-Term Care Home in Laval. At least 193 residents there have tested positive for the virus. That's more than 80% of the people who live there, and 88 of them have died. Here's a snapshot of the situation across Canada today. More than 1,600 new cases have been confirmed, and the virus has now officially reached all corners of the country. Nunavut confirmed its first case today. New Brunswick had another day, the 12th, with no new cases. A number of other provinces also reported no new infections. The bulk of the new cases are still concentrated in Quebec and Ontario. And Ontario had a bad day today. It recorded the highest daily death toll, 86 people in the last 24 hours. Premier Doug Ford says the curve, though, is flattening, and he says he's feeling more optimistic about reopening the economy.
There's a light at the end of the tunnel. And I am laser focused right now on opening things up as quickly as we can in a safe and measured way.
Ford has not set any specific dates for reopening, though, but his government did release more guidance today for how businesses can safely get going. It includes recommendations like installing plexiglass and putting markers on the ground to encourage physical distancing. Until those things happen, many businesses keep struggling and bills are piling up. Rent is due tomorrow. Some say they can't afford to pay. The federal government rolled out a new commercial rent relief program last week. It's supposed to lower rent by 75% for those that qualify, but the organization representing small businesses says not everyone will. They conducted a survey of businesses that reported needing help with rent. 38% said they do not qualify for the program. Of those that do, 9% said their landlords won't participate, so they won't get any relief. Mike Drolet has more on the frustrations as rent day arrives.
In Almonte, Ontario, when Equator Coffee closed its doors for physical distancing, they opened their eyes to a new business model.
We got a new website up and running.
Owner Amber Hall had to adapt, but not enough revenue is coming in to pay the bills. And with 2 Equator locations in Ottawa closed down, she saw the Rental Assistance Program, or CECRA, as a way to save her business. Her 2 Ottawa landlords ultimately agreed to share in the economic pain, but in Almonte, she's a landlord as well. And when only one of those businesses qualified for the program, she had a decision to make.
But the one that's dropped 50 to 60%, it's not going to help them. So thankfully, we were able to give them relief anyhow, but not through that program.
It's the details of that program that are causing headaches for Mark Tardif in Courtenay, BC. He hasn't sold much furniture of late, and he's paying rent from his savings. CECRA could be what saves him, in theory, if his landlord agrees. But in practice, the program won't be up and running until mid-May.
I'm really hopeful, but I haven't had a good indication yet from them. They're not. They want to see the fine print, and I don't blame them. And I mean, they're a business too.
I think reasonable people should be working this out in a reasonable way. But as a landlord, you can appreciate that if you've got bills to pay, you may not be able to afford to extend 75% to your tenant.
And many haven't. Smallbusinessincrisis.ca has been unofficially tracking closures. Every province has been affected, but it's when you zoom in on Vancouver and then in Ontario and ultimately the Golden Horseshoe that you can see how many businesses are in peril. The federal government is bullish on CECRA making a difference. It will evolve, they say, but it will take time and cooperation.
And I would encourage Canadian landlords to also act in a responsible way, in a way which is supporting fellow Canadians.
Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
Some new numbers are out on what the pandemic is doing to the federal deficit. The PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Watchdog, estimates the deficit will soar to almost $25 billion this fiscal year and then could skyrocket to $252.1 billion the next year. That would be the largest budgetary deficit since the mid-60s. The numbers could climb higher depending on how long emergency public health measures remain in place. The PBO estimates real GDP will shrink by 12% this year, pushing the federal debt to GDP ratio to 48.4%. It predicts once the federal emergency assistance measures end and the economy hopefully recovers, that ratio should stabilize. Well, before most Canadians knew anything about a shortage in personal protective equipment, a Global News investigation has found an operation was underway to gather up as much as possible and send it to China. In mid-January, Chinese consulates in Canada and around the world put out a call to Chinese nationals to help build a stockpile, at the same time as China was downplaying the seriousness of the virus. Abigail Beeman explains.
Every overseas Chinese is a warrior, reads this state media report from early February, saying Chinese nationals across the world raced against time to send back batches of scarce supplies for the motherland. It was mid-January when China put out an urgent call for help for themselves while hiding the severity of the new coronavirus that would hit the rest of the world.
It's a machine for charm offensives, but it is also, it's fundamentally a political warfare operation.
Author and journalist Jonathan Manthorpe is talking about the United Front Work Department, a powerful Chinese government agency used to influence Chinese immigrants worldwide. In just 6 weeks, China gathered 2.5 billion pieces of personal protective equipment, including from Canada, where they used consulates, state-owned businesses, and United Front community associations to send back at least 100 tons, according to Chinese reports. A 2018 CSIS report says the United Front has frequently been a means of facilitating espionage, and CSIS and RCMP sources tell Global News some of the community organizations reportedly involved appear to have members previously monitored or investigated by Canadian officials.
To me, it is utterly unconscionable that here are Canadians who are being intimidated and pressured in their own country by foreign agents.
That's when I learned that some PPE suppliers told the federal government in late January that China was trying to corner the global PPE market.
Conservative MP Aaron O'Toole says the federal government knew early but didn't act. Neither Health Canada nor the Prime Minister would directly answer questions from Global News about China's actions.
Our intelligence services were tracking and aware of the issues, and we got regular updates through the month of January. Further than that, I don't have anything to add.
O'Toole is calling for 2 inquiries, one about Ottawa's handling, the other a wider assessment with help from Five Eyes allies.
So it's up to the free world to hold China and global bodies to account.
A United Front report from March pushes back, saying groups are now donating PPE to other countries and to Chinese nationals overseas. Chinese consulates and community organizations did not respond to Global News questions. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
In the American state of Michigan, hundreds of people, some carrying guns, are protesting the state of emergency in place there because of COVID-19.
This is about each and every one of you patriots.
They marched on the state capitol building as lawmakers debated extending emergency measures. Some of them forced their way in, yelling at senators on the floor below to reopen businesses and end the stay-at-home orders. An experimental antiviral drug, originally tested as a treatment for Ebola and other coronaviruses like SARS, is being fast-tracked by the U.S. It's called remdesivir. It's not a cure and it won't prevent infection, but small clinical trials have shown it can help some patients. Jackson Prosco explains what it is and why it might be the best hope right now.
A potential treatment for the sickest of the sick, the experimental drug remdesivir may be effective in helping COVID-19 patients recover faster.
It got real for me when I laid down Sunday night and couldn't breathe.
29-year-old Drew McDonald was seriously ill when he was given the treatment as part of a clinical trial.
By the time I left the hospital, I was already improving drastically.
The initial results in patients around the world are similar. On average, patients recovered in 11 days compared to 15 days for those given the placebo. The death rate in patients given the drug was 8% compared to 11% for those who weren't.
This is not the total answer by any means, but it's a very important first step.
The drug was originally developed to treat Ebola. Researchers at the University of Alberta discovered it could also work on COVID-19.
We have shown that remdesivir inhibits this engine of the virus, and it works in essence in such a way that the engine needs gas, but with remdesivir it actually gets diesel.
But there are strong caveats. It is not a vaccine, and it won't stop coronavirus from spreading person to person. Right now, the treatment is only for patients who are seriously ill.
It's not a game changer, but it is a potential treatment. So a very important proof of concept.
Several Canadian hospitals, including Toronto's Sunnybrook, are now part of ongoing studies into remdesivir. In the fight against COVID-19, the drug is offering a rare glimmer of hope. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
Fort McMurray's fight to stop floodwaters. Coming up, how people are joining forces to save their community. There's some good news tonight for residents in Fort McMurray, Alberta. An ice jam on the Athabasca River there that was contributing to all the flooding has shrunk to about half its original size. More than 1,200 structures, though, have been damaged by all the flooding, and it could be a week or more before the nearly 13,000 people forced out can go back. Dallas Flexhog is in Fort McMurray tonight, where people are working together through the worst. Dallas?
This is being called a once-in-a-century flood, and with the chance for more flooding, the city can't even begin to think about recovering yet. Many are stepping up to help out in any way they can. Historical buildings downtown were saved from floodwater because volunteers stacked up thousands of sandbags to save them. The same group is handing out food now to the volunteers still on the ground. And with the city's food bank underwater, this makeshift car wash bay has turned into a pickup location. Many of the volunteers handing out essential food and supplies or evacuees themselves.
I've not heard one person say, I'm giving up. I've heard everybody says we're tired, but I've not heard one person say we're giving up. Fort Mac is going to fight on. It's going to stay strong.
It's hard to feel happy about it, but, there's always a little bit of bright side to everything. When you see the community come together like this and help one another out, it makes you feel good to say that you come from Fort McMurray.
Fort McMurray Mayor Don Scott was asked if he hates being mayor right now through this, and he said no. He couldn't be prouder at watching everyone double down on hope. Donna?
All right, Dallas Flexhog in Fort McMurray. Thanks. Still ahead, Russia under pressure as the Prime Minister tests positive. The man who is tasked with leading the response to COVID-19 in Russia is now sick himself. Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin tested positive on the same day. Russia had a record spike in new cases, more than 7,000 today. That brings the total confirmed cases to 106,000. President Vladimir Putin has warned Russia is entering the most intense stage of the pandemic, and health workers are reporting shortages of protective gear. Next, wishing Captain Tom Moore a happy 100th. He did it. Captain Tom Moore turned 100 today, and the whole world is sending him best wishes. He's received about 120,000 cards, including a special one from the Queen, who is just 6 years behind him. She congratulates him for raising more than £30 million for Britain's National Health Service by walking laps in his garden. Crystal Gamansing on the celebration he never expected.
Happy birthday to you.
Captain Tom Moore is a UK treasure. Without handshakes or hugs, expressions of admiration for the Second World War veteran took all forms: artistic, grand, and heartfelt.
There is a letter here that conveys your appointment to become the Honorary Colonel of our Army Foundation College up in Harrogate.
That really is one of the greatest honours anybody could get.
Even with his new title, he says he's still Captain Tom, something all of the mural artists will be glad to hear. He even has the attention of the royal family.
He's a one-man fundraising machine, and God knows what the final total will be, but good on him. I hope he keeps going.
It's not just that he has managed to become the largest single fundraiser for the National Health Service, or that he is the oldest person to have a #1 hit in the UK.
Hold your head up high.
By walking 100 laps in his backyard before his birthday, he's inspired people.
Your heroic efforts have lifted the spirits of the entire nation.
As a tribute to the 100-year-old, a birthday flyover.
I'm so overwhelmed by these honours that I'm getting today. Really happy.
Praise, presence, and gratitude for those who walk into our lives, even if they are standing 2 meters away. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
And that is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. We leave you tonight with gratitude and condolences for the families of those killed and missing in that military helicopter crash off the coast of Greece.
Here at home, we turn to the forces in times of flood, fire, or other natural disasters. They never say no. They always put their shoulders to the wheel. The women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces are the hand of our intentions, the concrete expression of our valor and values as Canadians. And so we stand with them, and we hold out hope to find the missing.
Good evening, I'm Andrew Chang. Tonight, the desperate search for survivors and for answers.
She's going to be very, very sadly missed.
Off the coast of Greece, another Canadian tragedy.
I'm Adrienne Arsenault. Also tonight, beware the COVID-19 scams.
I was actually very devastated and scared.
As if the virus wasn't bad enough.
It's just like the perfect storm. Renters worry on the eve of a new month, and so do landlords.
And living with the flooding in Alberta.
We had minutes to get out.
Hard-earned experience tells them hard days are ahead. This is The National. Less than 2 weeks after 22 people were murdered in Nova Scotia, another tragedy for that province and this country.
Canada and its NATO allies now looking for a crashed military helicopter off the coast of Greece. Of the 6 Canadians aboard, 1 is confirmed dead, Sub-Lieutenant Abigail Cobra. The others haven't been found, and each passing day makes that less and less likely. Their families and fellow service members aboard HMCS Fredericton are trapped between hope and grief. And you can see that in the home port, Halifax, where people are paying respects and holding out for any good news. Now, to lose a loved one is always devastating, but as Kayla Hounsell explains, for many, this tragedy is compounding already fresh pain.
It was 1 week ago, Sub-Lieutenant Abigail Cobra, deployed on HMCS Fredericton, offered this tribute to the victims of Nova Scotia's mass shooting. Now, at just 23, Cobra herself has become the victim of a terrible tragedy. She was on board the CH-148 Cyclone helicopter when it crashed.
The Navy just filled her life. It was everything she ever dreamed of.
A graduate of Canada's Royal Military College, she was a Marine Systems Engineering officer.
She was a loving, giving young woman and just lit up every room that she walked into. She's going to be very, very sadly missed.
Cobra's body has been recovered. 5 others are still missing. Naval Warfare Officer Sub-Lieutenant Matthew Pike from Nova Scotia, and 4 members of the aircrew. Pilots Captain Brendan MacDonald, also from Nova Scotia, and Captain Kevin Hagen from Nanaimo, British Columbia. Captain Maxime Miron-Morin from Trois-Rivières, Quebec, and Master Corporal Matthew Cousins from Guelph, Ontario. All based in Halifax.
All of them are heroes. Each of them will leave a void that cannot be filled.
She is just like the most lovable person you would ever meet.
Pastor Jason Cole considered Abigail Cobra a personal friend. He's also now guiding her church community through grief at a time when there is just so much grief in the province she called home.
This is not the way that God intended. God made a perfect world. Humanity botched it, and he offers us salvation through his son. Abigail believed that. I believe that.
When she posted this video, Cobra, who moved to Nova Scotia as a teenager, wrote, "You can travel the world and still never meet anyone like an East Coaster. Glad to have been taken in by them, for I'd have it no other way." She is remembered as bold, brave, and a proud Canadian. Kayla Hounsell, CBC News, Halifax.
Investigators don't yet know what happened, and as Murray Brewster explains, they're facing a formidable challenge.
The Ionian Sea at sunset, deep and dark, as seen through the windscreen of a Turkish military helicopter. The frantic search today for 5 missing Canadians.
The Cyclone helicopter had conducted flight operations and was returning to the ship. At approximately 6:52 p.m., the ship lost contact with the aircrew, and a few minutes later, flares were spotted in the water.
A 5-year-old Cyclone helicopter had been in the air a little over 2 hours when something went catastrophically wrong, and it inexplicably slammed into the ocean and sank.
As far as we know, they're in about 3,000 meters of water.
And that depth will present perhaps the biggest challenge to the recovery. A large debris field on the bottom indicates the helicopter broke apart.
3,000 meters presents an insurmountable challenge for the Royal Canadian Navy, which means we'd have to seek assistance from allies or possibly from a commercial operator.
Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan told CBC News tonight all options, including the use of Allied diving vehicles, are being considered. Investigators have recovered the flight data recorders. They will be analyzed at the National Research Council in Ottawa. All operation of Cyclone helicopters is paused, but the Air Force expects to get back to business soon.
I do not have any safety concerns at the moment.
The Cyclone helicopters were only recently brought into service, replacements for the Air Force's 5-decade-old Sea Kings. Some of the 28 on order are still being delivered, and Sikorsky, the maker of the Cyclone, has dispatched a team to assist in the investigation. Murray Brewster, CBC News, Ottawa.
So this model of Sikorsky helicopter has had other accidents. Those include the 2009 disaster off of Newfoundland that killed 17 people and a 2017 crash in Ireland that killed all 4 on board.
Now to the latest developments in northern Alberta, where communities are ravaged by flooding. The ice jam on the Athabasca River has been melting due to warmer weather. It's now half of what it was, but the damage is done for the more than 13,000 people who were forced to flee their homes starting 5 days ago, most of them from Fort McMurray. And remember, just 4 years ago, wildfires wreaked havoc on this part of the country. Rafi Boudjikanian shows us that, once again, the people here are exiles from disaster.
We got some food, we got some water.
Pickup time at the donation center. Just the bare necessities, luxuries now for those who fled home fast.
The police were knocking on our door. They said we had minutes to get out.
That was Sunday. Sherry Horlock and her family left with almost nothing. Now they've been able to stock up thanks to the efforts of this volunteer center.
We wanted to donate 20 sandwiches to the firefighters and police and responders.
Billy Martin's brainchild. He owns a sandwich shop in Fort McMurray.
And then it turned into 300 sandwiches for the evacuees, and it turned into this with a couple phone calls and Facebook posts.
But in the midst of a public health pandemic, concerns stretch beyond material needs. Horlock's temporary shelter is a crowded oil sands work camp.
Because there's so many people, and anybody just a little cough and you think, oh my God, goodness,
Then there are those who had already lost so much. Carolyn Boudreau's condo burned down in the 2016 wildfire, and she's fled her new place because of the floodwaters.
Definitely wonder, what next? What's next? Is there anything else? Tornado maybe? Are we in tornado country? I don't think so, but I'm trying to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
that light may be further away than some might hope. Up to 7 more days for full re-entry into the community.
We need a number of conditions to be met in order for residents to return to their communities safely. Those conditions include flood water no longer being an imminent threat.
And only then will it be clear the full scope of what needs to be rebuilt. Rafi Bujikanian, CBC News, Fort McMurray.
Cases of COVID-19 have now reached every province and territory in Canada. Today, Nunavut confirmed its very first case, someone in Pond Inlet. It's not yet known how that person got infected. Across the country, Canada now has more than 53,000 confirmed cases. More than 3,200 people have died. So that number of lives lost is known, but what lies behind it, who the victims are, how they lived, how else they might be linked, is not. Those details aren't released in statistics. So CBC News has made it a mission to gather that information. We're calling the project Lives Remembered. Renee Filipponi with some of what we're learning.
These are some of the people lost in just the first weeks of the pandemic. The first 1,000, part of a database compiled by CBC News. Helen Doige Hall was 102, one of the oldest to die.
Have them here. I could show you some of them. They are huge.
Her daughter says she spent years documenting family history. Throughout her long life, she maintained an exceptionally positive disposition.
She recently had a pacemaker put in, and the nurse that had been looking after her said, "Oh, Helen, I'm not going to see you tomorrow. It's my day off. I hope everything goes well." And Mom said, "Oh, don't worry, it will."
At the other end of the spectrum, Nicole Hoffman. In her 20s, she's Canada's youngest known victim of COVID-19. Her fiancé has started a fundraiser to honor her love of animals. Our data found the gender split was fairly even, that 8 out of 10 deaths were people over the age of 70. And while most were retired, those still working were diverse, from healthcare workers to a youth worker, a high school custodian, and a musician. In one case, a mother and daughter with a close bond, 93-year-old Ruth Shepard and her 56-year-old daughter, Tammy.
Very sweet relationship, very special. Tammy lived with my grandmother her whole life.
The pair had recently moved into this nursing home, hit hard by COVID-19. Tammy Shepard died 6 days after her mother. So much about Canada's first 1,000 deaths is still unknown. In provinces like BC and Alberta, demographic information is provided regularly. In other places, that level of detail is difficult to get. All the while, the death toll in Canada rises daily, past 3,000 now. Renee Filipponi, CBC News, Vancouver.
So as we said, those stories are important to tell. They help us see past that enormous statistic, that death toll, into the true human loss. If you want to share the story of someone you lost to this virus, reach out to us at covid@cbc.ca.
Well, Alberta has joined other provinces in unveiling its plan to relax public health restrictions.
What we need to do is manage the risk. And that's what our relaunch strategy is based on.
Premier Jason Kenney says the multi-stage plan will begin Monday with the resumption of some surgeries and reopenings for some healthcare providers like dentists and physiotherapists. It'll be mid-May, though, before non-essentials like shops, bars, and restaurants can open their doors.
We cannot wait this out. We must adapt and adjust our lives living with COVID-19.
Newfoundland and Labrador introduced its own plan today, following New Brunswick's lead to immediately allow people to expand their social bubbles to include one other household. May 11th was also set as a target date where, if certain conditions are met, some low-risk businesses could reopen and certain medical procedures would resume. Now, of all the provinces and territories, Quebec has been hardest hit by COVID-19, but it also has the most ambitious target for relaxing restrictions, starting Monday in most of the province and just a week later in Montreal. Alison Northcott shows us why that's causing anxiety, especially in outbreak hotspots.
As Quebec moves to slowly start reopening in the coming weeks, officials in the borough of Montreal North are working to contain an outbreak, and some want more time.
If we want to flatten the COVID-19 propagation curve, we should wait for Montreal. Should wait especially for Montreal North.
The Quebec government says it's watching things closely here and in several Montreal hospitals hit by outbreaks. At this one, the virus is complicating things in the emergency room, and some worry the reopening could push it to the limit.
If we see another surge of COVID while we're still in the first surge, then it's not going to be nice. It's going to be really a problem, I think.
The Premier acknowledges the battle in Montreal isn't over and says his plan to reopen schools, daycares, and some businesses over the next month can change if conditions demand it.
It's time to be more disciplined than ever. If we stop our efforts and the situation doesn't improve in Montreal, I won't hesitate to push back the reopening.
He says the outbreak in most of Quebec is under control, but still expects more cases and more deaths in the coming days.
We're on the front line. We hear what's going on.
This ER doctor says hospitals should be able to handle a new wave if restrictions are eased carefully.
We're agreeing with going to the next step as long as it's contained and it's well controlled.
But the nurses union says its members are already stretched and worried about what might come next.
They feel extremely stressed by knowing that, because of course the risk of contamination is going to increase drastically.
The province says it will ramp up testing in Montreal North in the coming days and across Quebec in the coming weeks. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
For millions of Canadians, rent is due tomorrow, but with businesses shuttered and so many people out of work, some won't be able to pay. As Briar Stewart explains, others are choosing not to.
Every night in Metro Vancouver, people cheer for healthcare workers. On these balconies, everyone is a renter, including at this building where Ryan and Kathleen live. The couple didn't want their last names used.
We both lost our jobs basically early on in March. Got lots of debt from the winter, credit cards and stuff, so it's just like the perfect storm for...
Kathleen is receiving the federal government's emergency benefit, and Ryan is on EI. They didn't pay rent last month and won't in May either.
We kept what would have been rent and spent it on food and basic stuff.
Across Canada, about a third of households rent. BC launched a $500 rent subsidy. More than 50,000 people applied, but many are finding out they're ineligible because their income was too high last year.
The next couple of months are going to be very critical.
David Hutniak is with a group representing landlords in the province. He says the federal government should have launched a rental supplement program as well, because if tenants don't pay, landlords who rely on the monthly income to pay their own mortgages could be in financial trouble.
Renters are suffering and unhappy, and so is our sector, because there's moratoriums on evictions and rents are not being paid.
Hutniak's organization conducted a survey and found 10% of BC landlords were not paid any rent in April, and there are fears the number could be higher in May. There's a campaign underway urging tenants to organize and join a rent strike.
That means both in keeping their rent today and in pushing back and resisting any attempts to evict tenants that have made that decision down the line.
Ryan and Kathleen say it doesn't make sense to pay part of the rent because it won't protect them from being evicted once bans are lifted. So they're meeting with neighbors who are in a similar situation and hope when this is over, they won't all be forced to find a new place to live. Briar Stewart, CBC News, New Westminster, BC.
Now, the anxiety, even desperation of Canadians in a cash crunch is just what scammers look for and prey on. And these days, they're at it big time. We've got a couple of stories tonight to give you a sense of what to watch for, starting with Makta Gabraselassie's look at loan offers to avoid.
Like other businesses, the COVID pandemic has taken a big bite out of this couple's doggy daycare.
We're getting about 3 or 4 dogs a day. That's a 75% cut in revenue.
After researching loans online, he got an unsolicited offer from First Capital Canada for a $20,000 loan. Looked legitimate, but there was a catch.
I had to put up a bunch of money in order to get a loan. It didn't make a lot of sense to me.
It's called an advance fee loan. According to the Better Business Bureau, it's illegal. Victims don't get the loan or their money back.
I think scammers are taking advantage of the pandemic to try to get more money because they know that a lot of Canadians right now are going to be strapped for cash.
Take a look at the Better Business Bureau Scam Tracker. Now, this shows complaints from across the country from people saying they lost hundreds or thousands of dollars, including this woman in Ontario who we agreed not to identify because of her job. She says she paid almost $4,000 up front to secure a $20,000 loan from Belford Capital Service, but the loan never came.
People are in desperate situations where they're counting on someone to assist them and help them out, and they're just taking advantage of you.
Two companies, two identical contracts. So the company that offered her the loan, its website is now down. As for the company that Terry was dealing with, First Capital Canada, its website was only registered 2 weeks ago. So we called them up. We tried several times. He hung up. Magda Gebrselassie, CBC News, Toronto.
The scam this next story highlights begin with a text and some apparently good news, but there is a catch. We'll let Katie Nicholson take it from there.
For me, it was convincing because I actually didn't know if they would send me a text or not.
After losing her restaurant job, Joanna Giannakopoulos had applied for the CERB, so she didn't think much of it when she got this text.
I basically had to sign into my bank, which was my card number and then my password for my online banking. And then after that, it was a bunch of other personal questions.
That's when she realized she was being scammed.
I felt that my money was going to be taken out of my account, so I was actually very devastated and scared.
She called her bank and the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre. Turns out, she's one of the lucky ones. In the last 2 months, the CAFC has received 739 reports linked to COVID-19 scams. In total, 178 victims have lost a combined $1.2 million.
It's the heightened sense of anxiety, of fear that exists. The isolation that people are in right now is ultimate key factor. Essentially, frauds are designed to get people to not think straight. So it's a prime time for scammers and fraudsters to solicit their scams.
One in particular preys on coronavirus fears, a message telling victims they've been exposed to someone who tested positive for COVID-19. When you click on the link, it infects your computer with malware.
So how can you protect yourself? Well, as far as the CERB goes, the federal government says it will never ask you to apply or notify you of a payment through text or email. Katie Nicholson, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, several U.S. states are pushing ahead with plans to reopen tomorrow.
I'm tired of going zipping up a body bag with somebody that I know.
Up next, the very real concerns in the southern U.S. tonight.
And later, we check in with Bianca Andreescu.
Where are you? I'm in my basement. This is where I live now.
How the Canadian tennis superstar is staying active while staying home.
And tonight's moment is a moment we are all waiting for.
Look, here it is! Give me a hug.
A post-quarantine hug from Newfoundland. We're back in 2.
Welcome back. Here are some of the international stories we're watching tonight. The British Prime Minister says there is reason for hope in the fight against COVID-19.
And so I can confirm today that for the first time, we are past the peak of this disease.
In his first press conference since recovering from the virus himself, Boris Johnson said he will unveil a plan next week to reopen the UK, but he warned an even bigger outbreak could occur if it's not done right. The UK has the second highest death toll in Europe at nearly 27,000. By tomorrow, dozens of U.S. states will have at least partially reopened, and many more will do so in the coming days. But many experts warn this is too much, too soon, prompting fears of another wave of infections.
Georgia was on the forefront of that push to reopen, to the dismay of many. Katie Simpson was there and spoke to those concerned about the impact on one community in particular.
8 months pregnant, Cher Salmon knows there's risk in returning to work. The single mom applied for grants and loans so she wouldn't have to reopen her salon, but didn't qualify.
I have no choice. I have to get back to work. If there was a choice, I would be closed still. Good to see you.
With the reopening of some non-essential businesses, there is concern in Georgia's African American community the public health crisis may worsen.
I wish that the governor would just chill out and let this thing fly, and then everybody can go back to work, not just the front line, who are mostly black, in this situation.
Kebby Williams has paused his music mentoring program for inner city kids, and he questions the governor's decision to reopen salons, barbershops, and restaurants where low-wage workers are often people of color.
It doesn't seem like he's thinking about us. It's like we're not even a thought in the matter,
Exposure in Georgia is a worry, as a new study there finds 80% of COVID-19 patients who need hospitalization are African American.
And it's like someone walking over to the wall and flipping the light on and exposing all of these healthcare disparities.
Mac Willis and his 2 sons are recovering from the disease. He says the crisis must be used to address the long-standing systemic lack of access to healthcare, one reason why this has been so devastating for African Americans.
I know these individuals in our community, and that's why I'm fighting for our community. I'm tired of going zipping up a body bag with somebody that I know.
The coroner in Georgia's hardest-hit county understands the need to reopen the economy, but with his rural morgue full, he's urging people to stay home. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Atlanta, Georgia.
Ahead on the National, At Issue looks at the politics of reopening. Quebec is the hardest hit province, so we look at why it's moving faster than others and whether that is a political gamble.
And we will be taking on some of your COVID-19 questions, including this one. I'm hearing more about the possibility of airborne transmission. Is this possible? The answer after this. Welcome back. It is time to answer your COVID-19 questions. And joining me tonight, infectious diseases specialist, Dr. Lenora Saxinger. Hello to you, and let's get started. This first question that we've been getting since the very start of all of this. I'm hearing more about the possibility of airborne transmission. Is this possible? And if we don't know, shouldn't we assume the worst?
Yes, this is a very contentious issue, and I think there's been a lot of more lab-based studies now suggesting this possibility, and it is a possibility. I think it's reassuring, though, that the WHO stance, the CDC stance are supported by the actual observation that this infection seems to spread mostly from one person to 2 to 3 other people in most of the studies, whereas airborne infections, where that's the main mode of transmission, usually spread to a much greater number of people, like 8 to 12, because you can contact them through entering an airspace well after the infected person has left. So it still looks like this infection is primarily from an infected person, and you have to be in fairly close contact to them or in contact with their secretions by touching your hands and then touching your face.
Right.
And so the overall pattern, I think, is reassuring.
Okay, that's interesting. Here's a question about the potential solution to all of our problems. Will the COVID-19 vaccine be a live vaccine, and will it be safe for all people?
Right. So there's well over 70 now, I think, vaccine candidates that are being evaluated. And as far as I know, I don't think any of them are live viruses. Most of them are using subunits of the virus and purifying them. So there would be no risk of actually acquiring the infection from the vaccine. It's just a specific part of the virus meant to elicit an immune response. So I think that the vaccines that make it through the trials will be very safe for anybody.
Okay. Will the COVID-19 vaccine be more effective than the flu vaccine?
Well, we don't even know for sure that we'll have an effective vaccine, but I think the odds are good. And I'm thinking that what we see so far is that the vaccine will not need to be changed seasonally the way the influenza vaccine needs to be changed. And so in that way, I think it would be likely to be more effective.
Okay. Dr. Saxinger, we'll leave it there. I always enjoy speaking with you, though. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thank you very much.
And as we've mentioned, we will be asking your questions about COVID-19 as often as we can, so send them in. Message us directly on Instagram at CBC The National, or send us an email at covid@cbc.ca. Just be sure to put The National in the subject line.
Ahead on The National, a post-quarantine family reunion.
Look who it is! Get in there. I want to feel some fresh air.
A simple hug is our moment as Newfoundland and Labrador relax restrictions. But up next, Rosie's here with that issue.
Adrian, as the provinces unveil their reopening strategies, is Quebec moving too fast compared to its neighbors? Tonight, we're looking at the political stakes and risks. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea will join all of us right after the break.
For the latest coronavirus pandemic updates, breaking news, and top stories, download the CBC News app now.
Across the country, provinces are moving forward with their own plans for reopening, but the province with the highest number of new cases, Quebec, has become a bit of an outlier, moving faster on some fronts than others. Premier François Legault addressed some of that criticism today.
If we stop our efforts and the situation doesn't improve in Montreal, I won't hesitate to push back the reopening.
So, how much of a political gamble is this for Quebec? It's Thursday, and I'm here with that issue. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Althea Raj here in Ottawa, all of them working from their homes. Okay, I did want to talk about Quebec because I understand, I hear what the Premier says every day. I certainly understand that there are different restrictions outside of Montreal rather than inside Montreal, which is really the epicenter for the province, certainly. But I'm still not sure whether this is too big a health risk, as his own public health officer says. It's a bit of a gamble, or whether this is really a big political risk for him. So I'll start with you, Chantal, because you are in Montreal.
It's both. François Legault has earned top scores for approval over his handling of the crisis, and he still enjoys, I believe, the confidence of the vast majority of Quebecers. But you have to be careful to take him at his word, as in Quebec may be moving fast, but it has not moved yet.
Yes.
And that has been made really clear. It will always be something of a gamble to decide when you do jump in that water that is reopening. And it is a fact that beyond the numbers, outside Montreal, the pandemic is very much under control. And in Montreal, the hotspots really are centered on old age homes and long-term care homes. But for sure, Premier Legault has a lot of capital, and he's put a hell of a lot of it on the table on this.
And the Prime Minister, Andrew, has been asked about it all through the week, and very reluctant, in part because it is Quebec, but maybe it would be with any province, to criticize or say anything about the approach that Quebec has taken. Is there anything he can do or say in this instance if we get 2 weeks down the road and it doesn't look like it's the right time?
He's got relatively few levers. Most of this is within provincial jurisdiction, and he wants to preserve, I think, capital with the provinces, with the premiers, to continue the kind of cooperation and collaboration that I think we have been seeing a fair bit of through this crisis, and that's a great asset for the country. It does have implications for neighboring provinces if one province or another has a renewed outbreak, because unless we're going to absolutely continue to keep the border sealed between the provinces, which is not good for the health of the federation or the economy, then you could see people migrating from one province to another and causing problems for the neighboring provinces. Some risk is permissible in this. It was worth it to shut down the economy to prevent an out-of-control outbreak that would have killed tens of thousands. It's not worth it to keep it closed to get the caseload down to zero. We just want to make sure we keep it manageable. The question is whether this is a smart risk, and I think the remaining item for concern is we do not have the testing capacity as of yet to be able to do what all the experts say we have to do, which is to be able to pounce on every case that crops up in future.
What do you think, Althea? Is this a risk? I mean, not only from a public health perspective, but as we talked about, a political perspective here for the Quebec Premier?
I think the risks exist for every provincial premier that opens. I mean, the provincial premiers have been front and center to this, to the pandemic response. And so if it goes badly, they will for sure wear it. I think what's important to stress is that Premier Legault, like frankly every other provincial premier, has said very clearly that they're taking baby steps, and if anything pops up, then they're ready and they're willing to go back a few steps, not just hit the pause button, but reverse decisions and go back to full lockdown. I think that it's going to be really important for people to know why decisions are happening, what the risk is, why can they go to the barber shop but they can't go to the movie theater, and the easing of interprovincial movement is going to be really important, that is very well coordinated. And for example, Quebec and Ontario, we already know that the border is not going to be reopening tomorrow, for example.
Yeah. Chantal, you went in there. Go ahead.
2 points. I think possibly Ontario, other provinces are not unhappy to see the Premier with the most political capital test the water. To see what happens, because the political risk is actually real. But the other reality that one has to acknowledge, and you don't need to be a public health expert at this point to have realized it, is that public health experts will have different opinions.
That does,
but I think there's a risk tolerance that, like, for example, Premier Legault today talking about how there are 44,000 COVID cases in long-term homes in the province. And basically just telling the population, brace for it. More people are going to die. There will be many, many, many more deaths, is what he told people. Like, that maybe is tolerable for Quebecers, but maybe, it would not be so tolerable for Newfoundlanders. I don't know, but I think that there is a regional difference, and people have different stocks. Different provincial leaders have the ability to say certain things that others do not.
I'll let Chantal respond, and then I'll get Andrew to wrap it up. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, let's be real. The way that people heard Premier Legault on this today was not, I'm allowing people to die. It was that this is happening and these people will probably not be saved, which is a very different proposition. It's not a tolerance issue. It's an information issue. This is happening to older people, and it's going to be very hard to reverse that curve in those settings.
But I will say, Andrew, and I'll get you to respond, that Dr. Tam actually this week said, when asked about Quebec, there will be different tolerance for risk across the country, not particularly in Quebec or another place, but it is up to people to mitigate that, how far they're willing to push themselves and their population. Andrew.
Yeah, there is actually some polling data that suggests Quebecers are a bit more tolerant of opening up a little sooner than other provinces, and that may be part of the political mix as well. And the need to take some chances is apparent because the cost of the economy is absolutely extraordinary, and we're finding out new data on that every day. Mm-hmm. That being said, if it's a choice between going a little bit slower and doing the testing versus going a little bit faster and having to take them back, having to put the controls back on, I would go for the former. The cost in terms of public morale and business confidence of having to reimpose controls after they've been taken off, I think would be enormous.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there, guys. Thank you so much. If you want to hear more from the three of these guys, you can subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. This week, we're going to talk about something completely different, the Conservative leadership race. It was paused. Now it's back on. Look for it on any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/The National. And with that, it's back to Adrian and Andrew in Toronto.
Just ahead, she's off the court, but Bianca Andreescu is still in the game.
I need some coffee.
It didn't end very well for you.
There was some glitches.
We talk through her virtual performance and her new competitive outlet next.
But first, as we go to break, tonight's COVID-19 how-to guide, some advice, and a reminder that's about to become more important than ever. Over time, it's become easier to convince friends and family to take physical distancing seriously, but it is a challenge that will crop up again if Canadians get too comfortable and let their guard down.
And I can tell you from every shift that I work in the emergency department, and you don't know which side of this you're going to fall on.
You don't know, doctors say, because not all young people are resilient, the same way not all elderly people are vulnerable. If you get infected, you roll the dice. And we do know that you can be infected and contagious without feeling a single thing.
One approach is to sort of appeal to the greater good and say, look, you may not be susceptible, but people who are older, people with chronic diseases, people with weak immune systems are, and you might expose them. So do this for their sake.
If we follow best practices, yes, it will all have felt like an overreaction. But that's the point. The best case scenario, if we all stay away from other people, is that nothing happens.
I'm Tom Power. When I thought I might get a TV show, I never thought it'd be from my actual living room. I'll be chatting with all sorts of great people, artists, first responders, and you. Watch What Are You At? Sunday at 8 on CBC and CBC Gem.
CBC Listen. Hear it all here. Download today.
I'm Jamie Poisson, and tomorrow on CBC's daily news podcast Front Burner, a long-time investigation into fashion mogul Peter Nygard and the shocking sexual assault allegations from 46 women, including at least 17 Canadians. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, my name is Carmelo Kuki. I'm in my mid-40s, and I'm a resource teacher with the Toronto Catholic District School Board. Part of the work I do is embrace new technologies and deliver help to teachers. Using this 3D printer, we're producing personal protection equipment for our healthcare workers. My specialty is STEAM, integrating science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. We've produced 50 of these headgears for the Michael Garron Hospital. We're a family of 5, and every room becomes a homework space. Projects in the living room, 3D printing. But we do our best to help where we can. What I'm hopeful for is that people become really appreciative of the fact that they can just go out and see family and be with friends in public places and really enjoy being around each other's company.
So teaching is just one of the jobs upended by this pandemic. Another, tennis superstar. If 2020 was going according to anybody's plan, Canada's own Bianca Andreescu would be prepping for a serious summer of competition, but instead, she's at home, finding her own way through this. So we dropped by virtually to say hi.
How are you?
You look good.
So do you. Where are you?
I'm in my basement. This is where I live now. My parents are upstairs.
Right about now, Bianca Andreescu of giant Canadian tennis fame should be warming up for the Madrid Open. She's not there, obviously, but the tournament goes on virtually. And in true Bianca form, she's all in, getting suited up in her basement.
Haven't done my taxes, I'm too turned up.
A little Drake walk-on music, some finger exercises for that game controller.
Oh my god, I need some coffee.
And some serious commentary along with her moves.
Oh, damn it. If only I can hit these aces in real life.
It didn't end very well for you.
There was some glitches that were happening, but I mean, I guess my connection is just really, really shitty, or I'm just that bad.
And practicing the real thing is hard now.
I'm not hitting. Everything's canceled. Like, you can't go in a park. You can't use a tennis facility, so...
Like, there's no driveway nearby that you could get one of those, balls on a string and...
I'd rather just use my mind than do that.
The athlete in her never quits, and there's a new game with Dad. Chess.
It's definitely bringing, the competitive aspect out of me.
I'm a little afraid for your dad in this moment.
You should be.
I know.
Because I'm actually pretty decent.
And she's okay. Thankful every day, she says, for what she has and for those on all the front lines.
Ultimately, you are protecting all of Canada, so thank you.
Well, they are Team Canada, eh?
They are Team Canada.
So we should say that while Bianca may have lost that online tournament, a familiar face won on the men's side, Andy Murray, He donated half of his winnings to the NHS and to a tennis development charity.
Hey, I've always said time spent playing video games is time well spent. We'll be right back with The Moment.
Give me a hug. Give me a hug. Oh,
Tonight, it's something that once upon a time seemed so normal, a hug from Grandma and Grandpa.
For the latest coronavirus pandemic updates, breaking news, and top stories, download the CBC News app now.
Well, this family in Mount Pearl, Newfoundland, experienced a joyful reunion today when the province implemented a rule to allow 2 households to start socializing, aka the double bubble. Now, the children, Finnegan, 5 years old, and Seamus, 3 years old, they got to see their grandparents for the first time since the shutdown, and that's tonight's moment.
Guess who's here? Finnegan and Seamus are really close to their grandparents. They provided childcare for us for a long time, and they still do on a part-time basis. They have them 2 days a week.
look who it is!
So to kind of go cold turkey without seeing them for a long time, it was really tough on all of us. You know, they're best buddies. So we've been having a couple of window visits over the course of the last 7 weeks, but trying to explain that to a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old is really difficult.
I can't believe I saw Nanny and Puppy
I know.
in our house.
Give me 5.
Now they're gone.
Yeah, they had to go home. But what are you doing tomorrow?
Sleep over with them.
Okay, so firstly, of course, they have a cool name for it, the double bubble. Of course, Newfoundland would do that. And I have to say, the idea of coming up with a list of people you want to hug is kind of delicious to me.
Yeah, except the hard part is you can only pick one other household, right? You gotta pick and choose. I don't even know how you begin to make that choice.
Oh, it's easy.
Oh.
Listen, that is the national for April 30th. Good night.
Good night.
Good evening, I'm Ian Hannamansing. Tonight, the government bans hundreds of firearms.
Canadians deserve more than thoughts and prayers.
We'll look at the justification and the timing.
They're using this pandemic as a way to bring in a major policy decision.
What the policy means for gun owners.
It never happened.
Joe Biden denies a sexual assault accusation.
The person applied and shouldn't have.
The potential risk of taking emergency funds not meant for you. And honoring the Canadians on a crashed military helicopter.
And we will always remember them.
Off the coast of Greece, it's now a recovery mission. This is The National. 13 days after the Nova Scotia mass shooting began, the government says the market for what it describes as military-grade assault-style guns has closed.
These weapons were designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. There is no use and no place for such weapons in Canada.
In announcing the immediate ban of 1,500 types of firearms, the Prime Minister cited Canada's worst mass shootings, the Polytechnique Massacre, the murders in Mayerthorpe, Alberta, and Moncton, New Brunswick, and the horrific rampage in Nova Scotia, still so fresh in the minds of Canadians. But the opposition says the policy doesn't deal with the real problem. Salima Shivji has the details.
We remember how our sense of safety was shaken.
Evoking painful memories, the Prime Minister says enough is enough. Not yet 2 weeks after Canada's worst ever mass shooting killed 22 people.
Their families deserve more than thoughts and prayers. Canadians deserve more than thoughts and prayers.
The timing opportune, the Liberals hope, for a ban long talked about.
These guns make it easier to commit mass murder.
On the list, 1,500 types and their variants of assault-style guns. As of today, restricted and no longer sold. If you own one, you can keep it for now, but can't use it. Firearms like the one that took 14 lives in the Polytechnique massacre, and 2 that officials say the gunman in the Nova Scotia mass shooting used just days ago. But those 2 were obtained illegally, raising questions on whether this ban would have made a difference. What the government calls a sweeping gun control measure completely misses the point, says the opposition.
Going after people who traffic in firearms, who smuggle in firearms, who illegally modify firearms, that is what will actually save lives in this country. And what the Liberals are doing is just symbolism over substance.
And what wasn't said here, but quietly later, there will be an option for gun owners to have their weapons grandfathered, applying to keep them instead of selling them back to the government. A bitter pill for survivors of gun violence.
If you're offering grandfather clauses, I'm sure that means that, many, if not most, gun owners will be able to keep their assault weapons.
And so the Liberals are walking a fine line in a highly polarized debate, keeping but softening a long-standing promise and repeating that details on legislation for the gun buyback program are yet to be worked out. Salima Shivji, CBC News, Ottawa.
The search for the Canadian military helicopter that crashed in the Mediterranean has gone from a rescue mission to one of recovery. The 5 who are missing now presumed dead. Kayla Hounsel looks at what we're learning about them and the investigation.
At 12 Wing Shearwater, where the members of the aircrew were based, there is a growing memorial today to match the growing grief. And on board HMCS Fredericton in the Mediterranean, a vigil for those lost at sea.
This decision was not taken lightly.
The commander of Maritime Forces Atlantic says despite the efforts of Canadian and Allied forces, time has run out.
We are certain that if there were survivors, we would have found them within the past 48 hours.
The body of Sub-Lieutenant Abigail Cobra was recovered when the Cyclone helicopter crashed Wednesday. Military officials say they have now found other remains, but have not been able to identify them. That likely won't happen until they are repatriated to Canada next week.
These proud military members died heroes, and we will always remember them. Captain Brendan MacDonald was a proud father in a house full of boys. Captain Maxime Morin aspired to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces since he was a cadet as a teenager. And Master Corporal Matthew Cousins was an outstanding aviator who kept the officers of his crew in line and focused on the mission.
Sub-Lieutenant Matthew Pike, a naval warfare officer, is also presumed dead. And Captain Kevin Hagen, whose father says he was caring and sensitive. Telling the world how proud I am of Kevin doesn't even begin to scratch the surface for those feelings of admiration I have always felt for him. HMCS Fredericton is now headed for Italy. The ship will be met by a team of Canadians, chaplains, social workers, and investigators. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder have been found, along with a helicopter door and pieces of the fuselage. Clues to help investigators determine what went so catastrophically wrong. Kayla Hounsel, CBC News, Halifax.
Emergency evacuation orders were lifted in some parts of Fort McMurray, Alberta today, but not for all 13,000 people out of their homes. Only some neighborhoods have been allowed to reopen so far, like this one, where floodwaters have receded enough. But while people in some downtown areas are relieved to go home, now comes the difficult task of dealing with the damage left behind. Rafi Boudjikanian has that story.
If you look in front, there's a shorter green building with the red and black lettering. Well, that's our sign. That's for Mr. Mike's.
For almost a week, this is as close as Mike DeRoche got to his restaurant. With a public health pandemic, the business already wasn't doing well.
Just sort of surviving, doing takeout and deliveries.
Then the flood hit, displacing him from his business and thousands from their homes.
We have spoiling food on the line, and our coolers and our freezers all has to be taken out and replaced.
Until this afternoon, he had no idea what else to expect. Then officials announced this.
But to be clear, conditions are improving and we're beginning to turn the corner from response to recovery.
They let a limited number of people back into the downtown core. Durocher's got some rotten food to get rid of, but he's counting his blessings as the building is dry. Not everyone's been so lucky. Some residents taking stock of what they still have and what they can't get back.
I'm nervous now because you know why? I lost everything and then I don't know what I do.
Yana Yakazu's basement was completely submerged, everything ruined. She says she didn't have time to grab anything, just her family.
Only my son and then my cousin and then all people because police you take care of us. Go out fast because water is coming fast.
The province is encouraging people to talk to their insurance companies and also to take advantage of a government emergency fund.
That there is assistance coming. Disaster recovery programs are intended for exactly this type of situation.
But with no sense of exactly when everyone will be able to come home and more than 1,000 buildings so far known to be damaged, repairs will be costly and the recovery will be long. Rafi Bujikanian, CBC News, Fort McMurray.
Alberta is also grappling with Canada's largest outbreak of COVID-19 at a huge workplace set to reopen on Monday, unless the union there can stop it. The Cargill meat processing plant is a big part of the food supply. 2,000 employees process 4,500 head of cattle every day. But rampant infections forced a shutdown nearly 2 weeks ago. More than 900 workers have now tested positive, and the plant is linked to nearly 1,500 cases. A worker in her 60s died. Carolyn Dunn shows us that some are afraid to go back in.
We have received some information that you might have had an exposure to somebody who had previously tested positive for
Third-year medical student Erin Kelly spends her days reaching out to people who may have been in contact with an infected person. The enormous outbreak at the Cargill meat processing plant helps keep them busy. While some people know the call is coming,
other people aren't really expecting it at all and can be quite freaked out when we call them. So a big part of our job is providing reassurance.
But as Cargill gears up to reopen the massive plant, many workers are far from reassured.
It's so scary to go into work every day wondering, am I going to contract this virus? And when I contract this virus, will I die from it? And what's going to happen to my family if I die?
We're calling this worker Rachel and hiding her identity because she fears losing her job for speaking out. She doesn't trust the reopening because even after the outbreak started, she says, public health protocols were not being followed.
Terrified. Absolutely terrified. Everybody was coming in, they're asking everybody a million questions.
The plant will open slowly, one shift a day to begin, and Cargill says it has enhanced safety measures inside the plant, as well as getting workers to and from work safely. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney says the reopening will happen under strict oversight.
We simply cannot shut down every food processing plant in Alberta or in Canada because that would create an obvious crisis in terms of food security.
But the union representing Cargill workers hopes to do just that. It's seeking a stop work order and an emergency hearing this weekend to prevent the plant from opening as scheduled. Carolyn Dunn, CBC News, High River, Alberta.
Now to some other people who fear about their safety on the job and also the health of the people they tend to. Nearly 1 million Canadians rely on home care workers. Ellen Morrow shows us the calculated risk some of those workers now grudgingly accept.
This is what we're supplied with.
Every day on the job, this personal support worker visits up to 10 clients in their homes.
We are to take our surgical masks, service a client, come back to our cars, take the surgical mask off, place it in the brown paper bag, and leave it there till we get to our next client.
Jody Fenlong Verberg works for Care Partners, a private agency providing home care across Ontario. In an email obtained by CBC News, Care Partners tells workers to use that same mask they start the day with until they are done all their visits, with some exceptions, and carry that mask carefully from home to home in a paper bag.
How is wearing one mask for every client with a brown paper bag for help suffice for proper PPE?
He's admitted by doctors saying in normal times it never would, but in the pandemic it's becoming more common. Even as Ontario Premier Doug Ford maintains there's enough PPE to go around.
If the caregivers need masks, give them the masks.
But Care Partners isn't alone. Even some hospitals are now reusing masks.
We have to do what we have to do so that if anything changes with the pandemic, we won't be left with a situation where healthcare workers are wearing nothing.
Earlier this week, Ontario lost another care worker to COVID-19, 51-year-old Arlene Reed.
She was just a rock.
Reed's children said their mother worried about not having enough protective gear, but went to work anyway. A hero, they say, and a devastating loss.
I'm just trying to figure out where do I go from here and how do I live without my mom and what do we do?
While other care workers fear their own vulnerability. Ellen Morrow, CBC News, Toronto.
Saskatchewan has a spike in COVID-19 cases. 26 people have tested positive, 19 of them around the northern community of La Loche. Across Canada, there are more than 55,000 confirmed cases and more than 3,500 deaths, but also now more than 22,000 who have been sick and recover. And that raises a question everyone wants answered. Once you've recovered, are you immune? Now, getting to the bottom of that is a key goal for researchers and health professionals. Vicadopia explains what's involved.
Herb Knapp is leaving this COVID-19 unit. With the worst over, his recovery continues in another ward. The evidence so far shows the antibodies he developed to fight the illness means the risk of reinfection from the coronavirus for patients like him is low.
In most cases, you would expect those antibodies to provide you with protection for a period of time. It is unknown what that period of time is, and it is unknown what the extent of protection is.
And even less is known about people who test positive for those antibodies but never had any actual symptoms. Eventually, that could be more than half the population. The science isn't clear about how much protective immunity they have from reinfection.
The technical term for this is correlates of protection, which is, what sort of level of antibody do you need to be protected? How long does it last? Those are all important research questions.
Not having those answers hasn't discouraged the use of rapid antibody testing by labs and hospitals. They can give a quick snapshot of where we are in flattening the curve, but
would it give me the confidence that I scored positive on that test, that I was now ready to queue up for a pint of beer in a crowded pub, shoulder to shoulder with all the other people there? Not really, no.
And that's frustrating for governments eager to get out of lockdown. Expanding antibody testing without understanding what those results, exposure, and immunity all mean has risks.
Herd immunity may be a very weak and fragile thing, and we may all be sitting ducks waiting for reinfection.
We'll only know for sure when streets fill up again and there's a second wave of outbreaks. Vicadopia, CBC News, Toronto.
Albertans are being asked to download a new phone application aimed at tracking COVID cases across the province.
Alberta Trace Together relies on the use of wireless Bluetooth technology to log interactions as an encrypted digital handshake.
If someone with the free app tests positive, they'll be asked to voluntarily upload encrypted data, which can be used to reach contacts who may have been infected. Dr. Hinshaw says privacy will be protected. The province's privacy commissioner says the agency will be monitoring.
The more we test, the more we find. We want to find positive cases. We want to investigate around those cases to go up the transmission chain.
Quebec is pushing to aggressively ramp up its testing strategy, going from roughly 6,000 daily tests to 14,000 by the end of the week. end of next week. Starting Monday, people with symptoms will be able to call a number and be referred to a designated screening center. An appointment should be made available within 24 hours. For people coming into Canada from abroad, the routine at airports these days is much different than it was a few weeks ago. That's just one part of this country's COVID-19 story. Here's Tanya Fletcher.
He's there. He's somewhere in there. Just have to wait.
Deanna McDonald hasn't seen her son in over a year.
They're asking him for the phone number of my husband. They're asking for a postal code. He had her address, but I guess there's a couple things missing, so they're going through a full form, and he needs to have everything on there.
This is the detailed quarantine form all travelers now have to fill out. Specific questions about where they'll be staying and how they plan to get there.
Thanks, Kaylee.
Roy and Donna Nichols had their daughters pick them up from the airport. As soon as they landed, they got strict quarantine instructions.
They want to know what your plans are, like how you're going to support yourself in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, and who's going to get your groceries, who's going to get your medication and all that.
And you could be fined up to $1 million.
Yeah, they made that quite clear.
And they've been warned they'll get follow-up calls as well. More than 9,000 phone calls have been made so far, including one to Anna Koje. She and her partner are 1 week into their quarantine after flying back from New Zealand.
We received a call from Service Canada after a few days, just checking in on us, making sure we're okay, making sure we had food and we had cleaning products and we weren't feeling unwell at all.
But the BC government says about 500 calls were not returned, so police were sent to their doorsteps.
And so a local officer would knock on their door and say, hey, the province has been trying to get a hold of you. You need to call them back. And what we found is overwhelmingly every one of those people responded back and engaged with the process.
Over the past 3 weeks, 16,000 travelers have come into Canada through BC borders, but about 100 of them did not present proper self-isolation plans, so they were immediately whisked away and placed under government quarantine at various hotels across the province. Meanwhile, Deanna McDonald is eventually reunited with her son. A moment of togetherness in an age of isolation.
I love you so much.
Tanya Fletcher, CBC News, Vancouver.
And as COVID-19 ravages the Canadian economy, a changing of the guard at the Bank of Canada. Today, Tiff Macklem, who takes over next month, cautiously reassured Canadians better days are coming.
The economy will start to bounce back. This virus is going to be out there for some time, and the Bank of Canada will play its role.
Macklem is a longtime veteran of the bank and had been second in command for 7 years. He replaces Stephen Polaws, whose term expires on June the 2nd. The switch is happening at a dicey time for Canada's economy and for millions of people suddenly out of work. The government's CERB program is meant to ease some of the pain. But as Catherine Cullen explains, some people seem to view it as an opportunity.
As the financial pressure from the outbreak builds, millions have received the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, including some who shouldn't have.
This is kind of just in its infancy right now.
Credit counselor John Coburn says he was recently called to offer advice on one case.
The person applied and shouldn't have. They didn't qualify.
He says the man's caseworker found out about the benefit application and convinced him to give the money back, avoiding serious consequences.
This person was in subsidized housing, was on a provincial disability pension, and all of that would have been affected.
And he is not alone. One Canada Revenue Agency worker tells CBC News that every day she sees people receiving the benefit who shouldn't be eligible. She says it's everything from those who seem to have been coerced into applying by family members to some who appear to just want some quick cash. We've hidden her identity and had someone else read her words because she fears punishment for speaking publicly.
When I quiz them about it, there's a variety of answers, from laughing in my face to trying to establish that there's some loophole.
She also worries people don't understand that they'll have to pay taxes on the money later and could lose access to benefits.
It could affect your housing. It could affect your social assistance payments.
Checks have even been sent to jails, Radio Canada reports, but stopped by corrections officers.
We knew the risk was there, but it was calculated, and we also knew we had to get the money to Canadians.
The employment minister says she was aware this program would be easier to abuse, but she warns the government will be checking up on those who receive it.
So we're going to cross-reference payments. We're going to be able to follow up on people if we hear, for example, that someone hasn't been truthful.
She says she sympathizes with anyone feeling financially squeezed, but they shouldn't take the risk of being dishonest to get the benefit. Catherine Cullen, CBC News, Ottawa.
For the first time, Joe Biden is directly addressing an allegation of sexual assault.
It is not true. It never happened.
Up next, the denial and the complications for his presidential campaign. And later, cooking at home with celebrity chefs.
Cooking lessons in quarantine.
Just what everybody needs, right?
And a moment of gratitude and celebration after weeks in hospital.
Are you ready? I'm ready.
We're back in 2. These pictures purport to show Kim Jong-un's first public appearance after weeks of speculation about his health. North Korean state media released the images of the opening of a fertilizer plant. Rumors had swirled after Kim missed celebrations of his country's biggest holiday on April 15th. Some reports suggested he was in grave danger after undergoing heart surgery. He was last seen in public 3 weeks ago. In the United States, Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden is denying an allegation of sexual assault. A former staffer says it happened in 1993 when Biden was a senator. Susan Ormiston has more from Washington and a warning: some might find the description of the allegation disturbing.
No, it is not true. I'm saying unequivocally, it never happened.
Under pressure from even his own party, Joe Biden finally answered the allegation that in 1993 he assaulted a Senate aide.
I don't remember any type of complaint she may have made. It was 27 years ago.
Tara Reid worked for 9 months in Biden's office. Decades passed, and then last month, for the first time,
we were alone, and it was the strangest thing.
She detailed a moment in a hallway on Capitol Hill when she says Biden pressed her up against a wall.
I remember the coldness of the wall, and I remember his hands underneath my blouse and underneath my skirt, and his fingers penetrating me as he was trying to kiss me, and I was pulling away.
Back then, her brother and a friend say she told them, but Senate staffers say there was no complaint from Reid or anyone else. But just last year, 8 women, including Reid, accused Joe Biden of inappropriate touching. He acknowledged his tactile kind of politicking, but recognized the times have changed and so must he. Now, the likely Democratic nominee is forced to walk a fine line between standing up for women in a Me Too era, championed by liberals, and defending himself.
Any woman, they should come forward. They should be heard. And then it should be investigated.
Democratic Senators Amy Klobuchar and Kamala Harris both defend Biden, and President Trump, who's waved off multiple sexual misconduct complaints, seems to relish his rival joining his messy circle.
It could be false accusations. I know all about false accusations.
There's no chance that Biden's defense will be the last word. Tara Reid is reportedly negotiating her first major TV interview, perhaps as soon as this weekend, with Fox Television. Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Washington.
May Day protests took place across the United States today, but they looked a little different this year.
They're not considering the people who have lost their jobs, their livelihoods.
This was the scene in Chicago as dozens of people defied a stay-at-home order and demanded an end to Illinois' COVID-19 restrictions. A counter-protest saw a caravan of cars supporting the measures but calling for further relief. And these nurses in California joined hundreds of others nationwide to demand more personal protective equipment. There were protests in New York today, too. Its governor has outlined a plan to reopen some low-risk businesses by mid-May. But the process will be gradual and slow. And for industries like entertainment and tourism, it could be a long time before anyone is back to work. Stephen D'Souza has that story.
For Canadian Paul Nolan, Rollo, Saskatchewan is a long way from Broadway.
After his starring run in the New York production of Slave Play ended in January, and with TV and stage auditions shutting down, it was time to come home.
I was in the middle of kind of fishing for the big fish when this all kind of came down, and we jumped ship and came up to Saskatchewan.
The curtains are closed on Broadway until at least June 7th. Unlike 9/11, when theaters reopened 2 days later to show the city's resilience, this time officials say events that draw big crowds will be among the last to reopen.
If they told us today we could come back, we wouldn't be able to be back between 4 and 6 weeks because we'd have to get our cast back together, we'd have to go through rehearsals.
The Broadway Trade Association says most shows can't afford to run in half-empty theaters, so they need social distancing rules eased and have safety measures in place to protect both the audience and performers. Tourists make up 65% of Broadway audiences, so the domino effect hits the city's hotels. Industry insiders say the key to bringing people back goes beyond testing and slowing new infections.
The biggest challenge is if public health authorities are able to convince everybody that it's safe to come back.
New York hotels are discussing a rating system like health grades at restaurants to assure visitors it's safe.
That'll be a signal to customers that, hey, this hotel's done XYZ in terms of sanitation, in terms of social distancing, in terms of equipment, and so those are some of the things that will bolster confidence.
Back on the farm, Paul Nolan is looking at a long hiatus.
I'll be lucky to be auditioning for anything seriously until next year.
He says he'll be back because the show must go on eventually. Stephen D'Souza, CBC News, Toronto.
Ahead tonight, culinary stars replace fine dining with home cooking.
Mothers and fathers who have 3, 4, 5 children at home, they can't be fine straining their soup. Like, they need to get the thing on the table.
We look at how the celebrity cooking world is improvising during the pandemic. First, though, we'll put your questions to the financial experts, including, how can I speak to my landlord about rent issues without putting myself in a position to possibly be evicted? The answer to that and more next. Welcome back. Time for your COVID questions. And tonight we're focusing on a source of anxiety for a lot of people, finances. And while the questions are specific, I think there is a wider relevance to a lot of them. So let's bring in our two personal finance commentators, Rubina Ahmed Haq and Preet Banerjee. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
And Rubina, let's start with you. Here's the question. How can I speak to my landlord about rent issues without putting myself in a position to possibly be evicted?
Well, there is no federal rent relief program for residential tenants right now. That really has been put on the provinces. So if you live in a province where there is some rent relief, you should be taking advantage of that if you are in some financial distress. Most provinces and territories have put a moratorium on evictions, so you don't need to worry in the immediate term for that. But definitely the best advice I could give is speak to your landlord or your property management company. One property management company that I know here in Toronto has a COVID-19 plan in place. They're allowing tenants to pay 50% of the rent now and 50% down the road when they get their job back. That helps the tenant out by not getting themselves in too much debt and helps the landlord out being able to pay their overhead costs like mortgage, utilities if they're responsible for it, and property taxes.
And of course, here we are, May 1st, beginning of the month, so those conversations likely are going on right across the country. Preet, let's turn the focus slightly to commercial rent. The question, how can the new commercial rent assistance program help my small business? What if it isn't enough?
Yeah, great question. A lot of landlords and tenants have this exact question because the criteria to be eligible is pretty strict. The small business has to show a 70% decline in revenues, and if they qualify, they could get potentially 75% of their rent reduced. But it's actually the landlord that has to make the application, and the landlord themselves then also has to eat 25% of the normal rent, and the remainder gets covered by the funds provided by the government. So because it might be tough for some businesses to qualify, what you might be able to do is still negotiate directly with your landlord. That doesn't have to fall under the purview of any of these programs. You can negotiate, and similar to what Rubina said, be proactive and talk to your landlord about what your options are. Maybe you can work out a special arrangement.
All right, Rubina, here's a very specific question. I'm a single mom living in housing with no child support because the father was laid off. What are my options?
So one of the options is to see if you qualify for the CERB. That would definitely help you out with $2,000 up to 16 weeks in 4-week periods. You can also see, because your problem is probably cash flow, so you can see what can you defer. So that could be your mortgage. It could be speaking to your utility companies about deferring some of the payments or going on a payment plan. If you drive, take your car off of insurance. If you're not driving that vehicle right now, auto insurance companies are giving that break as well. So really dealing with immediate cash flow problems is the first thing that you need to do, and speak to the fact that there are benefits available for children, especially parents. There is that extra up to $300 per child that is coming with the CCB, and that's automatic. If you already get the CCB, you will be getting that up to $300 in the May payments.
Yeah, there's a lot that's interesting there, including the car insurance thing. A lot of cars are sitting out front of houses or in garages, not being used, right, and still paying insurance on those. Preet, next question. My maternity leave's coming to an end. Will I be able to get EI if I can't work because of COVID?
Yeah, another common question. And the good news is, if your maternity period ends and you're unable to find work, then you will fall under the category of someone who has stopped work due to COVID-19, and you would be eligible to apply for the CERB, which again pays the $2,000 per month. Again, subject to the other criteria, which is, you had income of $5,000 in 2019 and the other regular criteria for the CERB.
All right. And Rubina, will this period of unemployment affect my chances of getting a mortgage in the future?
When you go and apply for a mortgage, the lender is going to look at your financial situation, how much debt you're in, how you've been able to make your debt payments, whether that be on your credit card, your utility company. So if you are going into debt and missing payments, then absolutely it could affect your ability to get a mortgage. Also, if you've seen your income drop, that is going to affect your ability to get a mortgage. So all of the things happening now may not have a direct impact on your credit score, but definitely when you go and apply for a mortgage, they are going to look at those factors before they lend you any money for a house purchase that you might want to make.
Really nice hearing from both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, we continue to ask your questions about COVID-19 on the program. So send the questions you have. You can message us directly on Instagram at CBC The National, or send us an email at covid@cbc.ca. Just put The National in the subject line. Next, a pandemic pivot on the manufacturing line, from car parts to face shields. And later, what a way to make an exit. An emotional thank you and a round of applause after recovering from COVID-19. That is ahead tonight. First, though, here's Andrew with tonight's pandemic how-to guide.
We're told over and over again, don't touch your face. That's because the virus gets in through your nose, mouth, and eyes. But if you wear contacts, then you're touching both eyes at least twice a day. So you should just stop.
Now, eyes are a place where you could theoretically get inoculated with the virus. The way to protect against that concern is to actually wash your hands extremely well with soap and water for 20 seconds before handling your contacts and putting them in.
So essentially, the advice is the same as it always has been. Yes, if you're touching your eyes, you should be washing your hands really well. But if you have the option of wearing glasses, should you?
I will confess that I've been wearing my glasses more often when I'm at work, because it does provide a measure of protection against droplets when you're in closer quarters. But if you're distancing, there's really no disadvantage to contacts. Just wash your hands.
Hey there, I'm Jamie Campbell, host of Blue Jays Central. I've joined an amazing group of volunteers called Conquer COVID-19. I have a car here full of great stuff, protective equipment going to Northern Ontario. Sometimes I lie awake at night wondering if I'm doing enough to ensure the health of my own 2 children. I'm quite certain that I am at this point. But here's where I find hope, and maybe I'm instilling this in those 2 boys by showing them that the essence of being Canadian is that we are willing to help each other through a difficult period. Hey there, North Bay. I come bearing gifts.
Thank you from North Bay.
Canadians across the country have been mobilizing, like Jamie, to help during the pandemic. And some companies are also playing a part, retooling production lines to fill needs on the front lines. Nick Purdon visited one Ontario factory to see how it's gone from making car parts to face shields.
Time is of the essence, right? So there's a big sense of urgency here.
Joe D'Angelo is using his factory to fight COVID-19. He spent his life building an auto parts business that employs 2,800 people across North America.
Hey, guys.
That's now on hold.
Hey, thanks for coming in, man.
Joe could have turned out the lights here, but he says the stakes are too high.
We just want to have an impact, you know? I think our generation's had life so good for the longest time, for decades, and really this is almost like our World War III.
Joe didn't wait. His company, Mitchell Plastics, started retooling their machines to build face shields instead of center consoles for cars before they even had someone to take them.
And we just jumped on it, bought the materials, and started making them before we had an order. So it's been a couple of weeks, and we think the first shipment is going to go out today.
The company isn't making money doing this. And what's more, all the people working here, like Danielle McLeod, they could have stayed home, but instead they volunteered.
Well, all the doctors and nurses are out there every day struggling to keep us safe. So whatever little parts we can do to help them out is just amazing.
Jaden Hamill is a safety manager at the plant. So normally he doesn't go anywhere near the machines.
It's cool to work in an industry where we're able to retool so quickly to be able to produce something that's not normally a product of ours.
Mitchell Plastics is on target to deliver around 500,000 face shields to frontline workers. Now Joe's got his engineers working on how to mass-produce test swabs. But it's not just Mitchell Plastics in Kitchener, Ontario that's joined the fight against COVID. It's a lot bigger than that.
I've called it the largest peacetime mobilization of Canada's industrial capacity. It is hundreds of companies, thousands of factories.
That's Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association.
We're just like in World War II when we were making planes and boats and guns. During a pandemic, the people who are on the front lines need things to get between them and the enemy. I get emails and messages from frontline workers who are in tears. And, they read the news and they say, we're there to serve and we're going to show up to work, but we're in danger. Can you help?
Volpe says working to protect against COVID is one of the most rewarding things he's ever done. And it's thanks to people like Joe and his staff. Of course, everyone here is eager for the day things return to normal and they're making car parts again.
Usually this plant's humming, there's a buzz. You can just feel it being very productive. It's full of people, working hard, and it's kind of heartbreaking. Making the face shields gives us a glimmer of hope in an otherwise very bad situation.
Nick Purdon, CBC News, Kitchener, Ontario.
Some of the biggest names in the culinary world have also had to pivot since the pandemic started.
Hi guys, welcome to Show Me What You're Working With.
Next on The National, cooking at home with celebrity chefs and how the way we dine is changing. Foodies forced to stay home because of the pandemic are cooking up a storm, and they're getting inspired by celebrity chefs sharing their wisdom on social media. Eli Glasner serves this one up.
Quarai, Cooking Lessons in Quarantine, Episode 5, Cooped Up Chicken.
Every night now on Instagram, celebrity chefs are mixing cocktails.
Just what everybody needs, right?
And conducting cooking classes.
We're going to add more cheese. Welcome.
Like many, Chef Dev Rajkumar is focusing on food that makes you feel good. Working from his parents' kitchen, he's modifying his approach.
There's a lot of people out there, mothers and fathers who have 3, 4, 5 children at home. They can't be fine straining their soup. Like, they need to get the thing on the table, right?
A little tablespoon.
As the COVID crisis continues, cooking channels are now whipping up new quarantine-inspired content.
Hi guys, welcome to Show Me What You're Working With.
Like this new show where Canadian Queer Eye food expert Anthony Paraski creates recipes with what a viewer has on hand.
Onions, basil, garlic.
Wait, what was the wild card?
Korean hot pepper paste.
While many food fans are looking forward to returning to restaurants when the pandemic subsides, This Iron Chef competitor says dining out will change dramatically.
We have the idea of the restaurant and conviviality and large format and large tables, large groups. Everything is going to go to the wayside, I'd say, for the next 2 years.
Welcome to Monogram Kitchen Stadium.
Canadian top chef Gail Simmons has gone from judging fine dining to competing against the chaos at home.
This is my real kitchen behind me, and it is a quick fire challenge every day.
But as someone who lived in New York City through 9/11, she believes the industry will adapt.
We will pivot. Takeout and delivery will be stronger than ever. And, you know, the way that we share food will become different, perhaps. The way that chefs cook and what they cook, I think, will be more in tune with the way we all need to feed ourselves, nourish ourselves. And then
Until then, she's serving up dollops of comfort, one recipe at a time. Eli Glaster, CBC News, Toronto.
Yep, hungry now. Next on The National, some good news. A patient who tested positive for COVID-19 at an Alberta hospital gets to go home.
Are you ready? I'm ready.
There's a great story behind this homecoming. It's next in our moment. Colette Sevigny is finally back with her daughter Louise after a long 5 weeks battling COVID-19 in an Alberta hospital. Yesterday, the 80-year-old got a homecoming filled with gratitude and celebration, and that is our moment.
When I went to pick Mom up, the transition coordinator said, we might just be a few minutes because we want to give your mother a really nice send-off because she is the first person to leave our unit that tested COVID positive.
Got such a send-off. It was unbelievable. But yeah, after being there for 5 weeks, they were like family.
You know what? Our family cannot thank you enough. Every single person in this hallway. You guys have cared and loved for Mom when we couldn't be here. You're a family. Thank you. I looked and I can't, wall-to-wall staff on both sides. And right by the desk was my sweet little mother, smiling and waving. None of us thought 3 weeks ago that would be the case. Are you ready? I'm ready.
So she had a fractured pelvis, she had pneumonia, she had COVID-19, and as you heard a few weeks ago, the prognosis was not looking very good. But she told our producer, Eliza, that her husband had died back in January and she didn't want her family to lose another parent, another grandparent, and so she decided to make sure she would pull through. She did, and what a marvel for her family and clearly all the people on that floor. That is The National for May the 1st. Good night.
Completely false. And
how do we make sure we're getting the full story? And what challenges do we face to get it? It all starts right now. And it all starts from right here at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg. This is a spectacular architectural building, but it's also spectacular inside for its exhibits. And if you're ever in Winnipeg, please find yourself the opportunity to come by here. We're just in one small part of this museum. It's quite something. I'm Peter Mansbridge. We're looking forward to this next 90 minutes or so, taking your questions on the subject you just heard outlined. And we'll be taking your questions live here in the room in Winnipeg, but also off the comments section of both Facebook Live and YouTube. So if you're watching on one of those platforms anywhere in the world, Don't be shy, send in your questions. And obviously our audience here in Winnipeg is primed to ask questions as well. This is the fourth in a series of these town halls, really, that we've been doing. We call them national conversations. We started in Vancouver, then we were in Charlottetown, then London, and now here in Winnipeg. I want to introduce very quickly to you our panel for tonight, all people with lots of experience in the field of journalism, in the field of telling stories. That's our business. We tell stories, and many of them are challenging to tell. These people have found ways to tell them in very different ways and exciting ways, all in ways that you've shown over the years that you much appreciate. Let me start with Diana Swain, who's no stranger here in Winnipeg, former host of the local supper hour show, national reporter for us here in Manitoba, now the host of The Investigators on CBC News Network, and also one of our lead investigative reporters. Rosemary Barton, another product of Manitoba, who's the host of, yes, you brought the family, Rosie? The host of Power and Politics in Ottawa, one of the most important programs on CBC News Network, looking at on a daily basis, Monday to Friday, the goings-on in our nation's capital and on Parliament Hill. Duncan McHugh, the host of Cross Country Checkup, and somebody who contributes regularly to the National with his documentary-style journalism. Paul Hunter, our Washington correspondent, who's flown up here today to be a part of this discussion because, there's not much going on in Washington. So why couldn't he be here? Adrian Arsenault, recently back from the Philippines, travels the world for us constantly, based in Toronto, does some of the challenging stories in terms of trying to get at the heart of an issue and trying to reflect all sides of it, and that's one of the things we're going to try and discuss tonight. Adrian's here. And finally, Nala Ayed, who's flown over from London, from our London bureau. Nala, we see her in London quite frequently, but we see her in all other parts of the world as well, as she does her amazing work as one of our lead foreign correspondents. So we've got quite the lineup of journalists for you tonight to try and handle some of these questions that I'm sure you have. And I think we can start right here in the audience with our first question. Go ahead, ma'am.
Hello, good evening, Peter, and all of you, each of you, to Winnipeg and to this great Museum of Human Rights. And my question has to do with truth. There are so many different perspectives of truth, and I wondered maybe one of the field correspondents, Adrian or Nala, and hopefully Rosie as well, back at Power and Politics. Just even yesterday, you were saying you need a flow chart to understand all of this. So I was hoping that you could try to shed some light on how do you discern, what would be your criteria in discerning truth?
Well, it's a great question, and it's obviously one of the ones that all of our journalists face every day in telling stories, whether they're one of these six or whether they're one of the CBC journalists across the country and including here in Winnipeg. But you suggested we start with Rosie, so let's do that, because that's her daily challenge, is trying to get to the truth on some of those stories that come off of Parliament Hill, where there are many times when nobody believes what they're hearing, and Rosie's got to get through that, wade through it to find out the truth.
Yeah, so that is my job, is to make sure that you guys get the information you need and that they don't. I wouldn't say that they're lying or anything. They're just trying to tell the story from their perspective, right? And leave out the parts that don't matter to advancing their political agendas. So how do I do it? I'm not going to lie. I don't do it by myself, because I have a show. I have a lot of people that prepare me behind the scenes with facts and numbers and information so that I can be armed, is sort of the way I put it. That when I go into interviews with people who I know are going to be mostly difficult and mostly want to tell the story a particular way, I have ways to push back. And the other thing that I do is, when I know it's not true, I say it, because I think that that's important. That's my job too. It's not just to allow someone to get away saying things that are simply wrong. You also have to call it out. I think right now, and Paul maybe can speak better to this, there is a perception that you are allowed to say that something is fake news because you disagree with it. That's not actually true. There are actually facts that are indisputable. and there are truths that matter. So people can try and frame a story and say that it's fake, but it's our job to make sure that we redirect them and point them to the things that are true. The sky is blue. That's it.
All right, hold on to your thought in response to this, Paul, because I want to show something of Rosie's that gets right to that issue of calling it out when you know it not to be right. And you don't always have these opportunities, but Rosie certainly had one in an interview she did 2 summers ago now with a former member of the Stephen Harper cabinet, Chris Alexander, on an issue about the situation in Syria and how much journalism had been done on the story in Syria and the fleeing of the refugees. Watch this clip.
This has been going on for years. Why did the government not act faster now?
Exactly.
I'm actually interested in why this is the first Power and Politics panel we've ever had on this.
Mr. Alexander, that's completely false, and I can send you links to the previous shows that we've discussed about this. We're discussing it during an election campaign because there's a crisis situation going on in Europe right now. But if you'd like me to send those to you, I can, because you've been on the show previously and discussed it.
I've never been on the show in a panel discussion on these
No, because
issues.
you weren't allowed to do panels as a minister. That's why you're here now. If you want to avoid the question, let's just be clear that that's what's happening.
I don't want to avoid the question, Rosemary. You want to avoid the fact that the biggest conflict and the biggest humanitarian crisis of our times has been there for 2 years, and you and others have not put it in the headlines where it deserves to be.
So, we did some checking. Since 2011, when the crisis began, Power and Politics has talked about the crisis in Syria 32 times, with some participation or mention of Chris Alexander. 5 times he appeared on this program to talk about refugees, including a one-on-one interview on May 30th, 2014.
Oh, snap.
Oh, yeah. So Rosie had a lot of trouble getting guests after that interview. No, that's being prepared and ready to tackle spin that's coming at you on the political front in this particular case. But Paul, if you want to do a quick add-on to that before we move on.
Well, I would just quickly say that the truth it can be a complicated concept, and it's a moving target in a lot of ways. And so what I do a lot in the U.S., away from the White House, is to, you just talk to as many people as you can. One of the clips that was in the intro, Peter, was from West Baltimore after the riots, after the death of Freddie Gray a couple of years ago. And, there was, the immediate thing was covering the riot. And then what's really going on here? And what is at the heart, what is the truth of the racial problem in the States, which is, a complicated question, of course, but to get closer to the truth, to chip away at the truth, is talk to people away from where all the action is. And that was one of the people that we were talking to there, not the guy that we were talking about in London, but talk to as many people as you can and get the various versions of the truth, and somehow, as people think their own truth, you'll just get closer to it. It's hard to arrive right at it, and I just think all you can really do is try, and how you try is by talking to as many people with different voices as you possibly can.
Just to tie a knot on it, one of the political spinners that I used to deal with and try and break through told me once, I'll never lie to you, but don't assume that means I'm telling you the truth. And it's an interesting concept, and it's the way we often try to go after those particular political stories. Okay, question from the web, just coming in right now from a chap by the name of Bud Cooper, Haliburton, Ontario. He asks, do you ever get emotional when reporting, or are you not allowed to? That's a good question. Adrian.
Why me? I would say the day you don't get emotional, go home. Because there's something fundamentally wrong with you if you're not feeling in your bones, in your DNA, what's happening. I am the one that cries at the phone commercials. This is me. I am a terrible weeper, and sometimes you get that thing in the field, and you guys have all felt it, where you just you feel your hair going up on the back of your neck. For me, I felt it a lot in Liberia when we were covering the Ebola crisis, and it's so far away, and it's so hard for people here to imagine what it's like there. And, there's a little girl named Esther, and the first time we encountered her was in a photograph. She had acquired Ebola. She fell gravely ill. When she recovered, she learned that both her parents had died of the disease. We're talking really like a little girl. And comes the day of the big graduation ceremony when everybody goes home because they're cured, and it's an incredible day, and this is supposed to be a miracle. Everybody's smiling and she's weeping because at the end of the graduation, your family comes and picks you up. And so she was sitting there on a chair by herself with her little bag, and no one was coming for her. Those are days. Yeah, but the benefit for us is that we get to write it out. You work with the pictures and you work with the sound and you tell the story online, on radio, on television, and it's a bit cleansing, I find.
Let me just ask Nala the same one, because she's seen an awful lot in her time reporting on stories, especially overseas, and especially in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
How do you handle that?
Well, I mean, it's, as Adrian says, I think you'd be lying to, so I'd be lying to myself if I said that I didn't get emotional and that it didn't happen on almost every single occasion. And the one for me that comes to mind is actually the rescue ship that I was on this past fall. I'm not sure if many of you saw it, but it was on the 5th Estate, and it was watching these people in the struggle of their life getting rescued in the middle of the Mediterranean. I mean, and the last thing they expect is for a journalist to be standing there with a camera, sticking it into their face, trying to capture this battle of their life. So imagine watching someone fighting for their life. I mean, forget wars, but someone who's trying to get away from something in the middle of the sea, at the mercy of the sea, and at the mercy of some young men and women who are on this rescue ship. It was really hard not to get emotional. I think the key, though, is to be emotional, but to not let it affect what you write, and to be stoic when you're on the air. To me, you can't show that emotion on air. It's just not something that I think any of us do, really. You can feel it. It might inform some of your writing, but I think that's separate from what you put on the air.
Yeah. I had a funny moment on Checkup this weekend, actually. We were doing our episode on teen suicide and the show 13 Reasons Why, and amazing callers from across the country, parents who were calling in about their kids committing suicide, teenagers talking. At the end of the show, it was heavy stuff. Amazing calls. But at the end of the show, we had a young teenager, and she said, "Happy Mother's Day." And this was the last caller, and then the music came up, and I don't know what it was, but it just hit me, and I started to get quite choked up on air, and I wondered about it for a second, and then I said, I just have to let it be, and so I actually said, you're going to make me cry, and I stopped reading for about 15 or 20 seconds, which was very awkward for me, because I'm used to being that stoic host. But I just felt like I had to let that emotion be.
Yeah, I think as Nala said, nobody, and Adrian too, that nobody tells you can't show emotion. You try to ensure it doesn't get in your emotion, your feelings don't get in the way of trying to tell the story. But don't assume that means nobody gets emotional, or that it means it doesn't impact you, not just then, but for a long time afterwards. Some of the things these people have seen, and even in my limited time on covering stories similar to that overseas, you never forget it. It impacts you as a person. It changes you as a person, what you see. So, we're not without emotion. There's a question here in the audience.
So my question sort of builds on the discussion that's happened so far, in that when it comes to injustice, the things that go against everything that you believe in deeply, the values that you hold most dear, can you think of a time that you really had to check your objectivity and ensure that you were reporting in the fairest, most just way to be representative of the whole story?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. All these are great questions, and we've all been through episodes like this. This whole museum is built on stories about injustice, and and the people behind them on both sides of the issue. But on your specific question, do you want to try it, Adrian?
I was just
first?
thinking about it. It's an interesting. You said, if I can understand, you say, can you ever think of a time? And I'm thinking that it's kind of every time, because in a way, what we do, and this is sort of my mindset of it, is that we're kind of professional strangers, and we're professional outsiders. So I am forever feeling like I don't belong anywhere at all, and that I'm always the fly on the wall, and that, in a way, I don't come from anywhere. I know it sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, and I hope my mom's not listening, but, I don't have brothers and sisters.
She's always listening. Your mom.
I don't have brothers and sisters. I don't have kids. I didn't grow up with aunts and uncles. I sort of don't have a sense of a place necessarily, and then I have a job that takes me to different places where I'm always new. And that's a bit of a gift when you're talking about dealing with an injustice or a difficult story, because people are forever saying to you, you don't understand. Nobody understands. And so your job is to say, I know. That's why I'm standing here. Help me. Help me understand so that I can then convey. And when that becomes your tool, is to say, I am new. Please walk me through this. That becomes your quest, and everything else gets parked.
One of the techniques that Adrian's used often throughout her career to try and get to the nub of a story like this is to try and bring the two sides together and let them talk it out in front of the cameras. And she did this most recently in Washington right after the Trump inauguration, where you saw on the streets over 2 days, two very different sets of people. Watch this clip.
Not surprisingly, the conversation drew some curious stares and a few side debates. And sure, there's still anger.
Cam, do you think I don't work in a man's world?
Well, if you're asking for a leg up.
I have never asked for a leg up.
Wait.
You're assuming we're asking for leg up. I've raised a daughter as a single mother.
So you believe in affirmative action?
Owns
So do you think that
business.
she should get a leg up because she's a woman?
She's never asked for a leg up.
Good time to remember it's cold and there's the baby. Right. Izzy just about having enough of this. We all decided to wrap it up.
I actually really like them. I would actually say that we are probably a strong group of women.
Then an exchange of contact information. That we didn't see coming.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, tell us how that happened.
Well, it's interesting. Outside the office in Washington, there's a hotel. And so it was the morning of the Women's March. We went by the hotel, and there are some people sitting on the curb, having a smoke. And it was the inaugural balls the night before, and they're watching the women's marchers go by. And we're looking at a couple of them going, what are they doing? They didn't understand those women who were walking by. And some of the women walking by were looking at some of these women in their fur coats and thinking, what? So we grabbed a couple of them and said, what's happening here when you guys look at each other? And invariably the answer was, I don't understand them. They don't understand me. I'd be happy to talk to them, but they'll never talk to me. And so at the end of the day, we got their numbers and said, if you're serious, let's have a conversation. And we couldn't agree on where to talk, of all things. That was the problem, where we're going to talk. So I just called time on it and said, we're going to do it right here, because that's where we first met. So they agreed to talk on the street. And the weird thing is they have stayed in touch, those women. I don't know that the conversations are always gentle. No one's going to anybody's house for dinner. But they call each other every now and then when something squirrely happens, every 8 minutes or so.
Another question from here in the audience. Go ahead.
Hey, so as a proud millennial, I know that our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter and shorter when digesting news, and we go to other sources. So I'm wondering, in terms of how you present a diversity of opinions, you may have them, but how do you ensure that we get them in a really short soundbite, because we get tired and want to go to something else?
Okay, let me bring in Diana into the conversation too.
Thanks. I don't have an answer for
expertise
that.
on this one.
I'm not sure that we can remedy that. I think that we are always struggling with the task, which is to get the information in front of viewers, readers, listeners, because we're all filing across all platforms now, as we call it. And we're trying to get those diversity of opinions and points of view and the facts, and to also shape it in a story, a narrative that makes it, frankly, more interesting to listen to. But to do that at the speed of light comes at the cost of everything that's good about what I just mentioned. So I think we try to balance that and ultimately hope that we've structured the story that we're telling you in such a way that we convince you to give us another 15, 10 seconds of your time and to read it a little bit longer. And it's interesting, there's a story I wrote for CBC News Online last week that I knew was dense. I knew was complicated, was not going to interest everybody. It was about money laundering by a Russian syndicate in Canada. Complicated on a whole bunch of levels. And I was talking to the person who was putting it online, and she said, your retention on this one is 1:45 seconds. That was high five worthy. For someone to spend that long reading a story, you can actually get pretty far in there. And it was comforting to me, too, to think that people are spending more than 10, 15 seconds, because I think we worry that people are just reading a headline, maybe into the first paragraph and gone. And there's some metrics that say that that's true. But I think if the stories are well constructed and we're telling people what they're interested in hearing about, they'll stay with us.
I have a point. Can I?
Yep.
Okay. Just quickly. We do two things on our show. Not that I want you to just look at minutes of the show, but we do use something called Snappy TV. So we snap out on Twitter and social media like a minute or 2 minutes of a best exchange. That's easy. And then this will be very quick. The other thing we do with our show is we turn it into a podcast. So we just throw it up after the show is over and it becomes a podcast, which may sound like not a big deal, except I realized the other day that some people have no idea what I look like, or that it is a TV show. There are a lot of millennials who just listen to the podcast, and they I don't know what they think I'm talking about when I say let's look at the tape, but some of them just listen to the podcast. So I do think we're doing things to try and reach out to people because you consume news in all different kinds of ways. So whether we're doing it online or podcasts or whatever, I think we're trying to make sure everybody can access us.
All right. Let me remind millennials of a television news anchor who was sort of set the standard for all who've come since, and that was Walter Cronkite at CBS in the United States. And one of his sayings was, a television newscast, in other words, the stringing together of the 1.5, 2 minute clips, if you wish, of news stories, is and always will be just the headlines. Just the headlines. You take a transcript of the newscast, a half-hour newscast, you probably couldn't fill the front page of most of the great newspapers in the world with that transcript, which gives you a sense of how much information is there. It doesn't account for the fact that pictures have their own value as well. But what it means is if you want real information about those issues that concern you, you got to go beyond the newscast. You've got to search out whether it's articles on print, but better still for us is if you look at the longer form journalism. And one of the greatest advocates of longer form journalism is Duncan and what he does. So make the case in a minute or less for the longer form television journalism.
I'm actually heartened by the numbers that we've seen on our online platforms for our long-form journalism, and everybody that you've seen here are some amazing storytellers. At the National, we have the luxury of digging deeper and going longer. And I actually don't buy the argument that millennials have a short attention span. I think what they do have is a strong BS sensor. And when they see good journalism, they're willing to invest 5, 10, 15, half an hour watching it. And so I have seen our numbers and our metrics that Diane talked about, and I don't actually think that the short attention span that we're talking about means necessarily the death of current affairs, as we call it, or long-form journalism. I think there's an appetite for in-depth analysis. That's what's going to keep us in our job in this very changing world of journalism, is our ability to offer that analysis.
All right. I love this question. We could all handle this. Let me start with Paul on it. Michael Hind asks this: who says that a journalist has to reflect all sides of a story? For example, when you're dealing with a scientist versus a non-scientist, why should a journalist give both credence? And I guess the biggest example of that is often is the climate change issue, but you heard the question as asked.
And I'm going to do what any smart person would do, which is punt it to a slightly different subject. Because, to the earlier question, I was going to talk a little bit about guns in the U.S. And after Newtown, I started thinking that because if it had come to me in the cry thing, I cried at Newtown, And one of the stories we did in the days after that was a group of people who it was like, we just can't take it anymore, man. And like they got together in their kitchen and they said, we are going to start to change the rules about guns. It's too much, right? And our whole piece was about this the dawn of this group, which still exists, by the way. They've renamed themselves, but they're still out there. They still haven't, obviously achieved what they set out to do. But the piece didn't have the other side in it. We didn't go to the NRA and say, what's the case for more guns? Even though they made it after Newtown. But we didn't think there was a need to balance that. And we were talking about this the other night, right? And there are sort of truths of a kind, back to the truth question, right? Different people have different views of that. And I think it's okay at times not to. The climate change is another good example. There will be people who will always say, well, you have to have somebody say, well, it's not, who knows, right? Well, smart people know, and smart people have really thought hard, and there is tons of evidence, and that's the story, man. And I think that we ought not be afraid of that. And equivalence and things like that, emails, Hillary Clinton, it comes into play. But at the end of the day, I think you have to curate that kind of stuff and be smart about it. That's how I approach it.
Rosie?
Well, we had an example of this in Ottawa recently with Senator Lynn Bayak. I don't know if you followed that story at all, but she gave a speech in the Senate where she wanted to talk about all the positive things that had happened at residential schools. And on, and she claimed that if you read the whole speech, you would understand, and I read the whole speech 15 times and still didn't understand. And so we did interviews every single day until she was pulled off of this committee about Indigenous people. And we talked to a lot of people, and certainly, I don't know everything about the subject, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said that residential schools were intended to kill the Indian in the child. That to me seems pretty indisputable. So for a white senator to come forward and say that she knew some Aboriginal people who had had a good experience, that wasn't okay. So we did seek out other parts of that story, and there were people who said, yeah, I learned how to play hockey in residential school, and that was a good thing. But there was nothing wrong, I think, in that instance in saying that is not the truth that we are comfortable with in this country. And you, in a position of authority and power, should not be repeating something like that. And then we never heard from her again.
Peter, can I just...
Yep.
We used to have these four-core forums back in the day.
That's a foreign correspondent.
Foreign correspondent forum. And Patrick Brown, the amazing woodland creature that is Patrick Brown, this amazing man, used to say, hey, there are lots of sides to stories, but they're not always equal, so you can't always treat them as equal. And it isn't, 38 seconds to the guy who says it is a duck and 38 seconds to the guy who says, no, I don't think that's a duck. It doesn't always work like that. That's a very
and it ought
construct.
not.
No. Yes, and it ought not to. Exactly.
My favorite Patrick Brown story, very, very short. He was the Nala Ayed and the Adrian Arsenault of his day, one of them. Covering big stories around the world, but he also covered the funeral of Elvis Presley.
Did he really?
And he was always upset about those who believed that Elvis was still alive. Because at the funeral, he actually looked in the coffin. And there was Elvis. All right, we have a question here.
Hello, I am Erin. I'm a school psychologist in Winnipeg School Division, and I work with a really high Indigenous population. A question that I have had for a long time is that in the news, Indigenous youth in particular see a certain perspective of Indigenous peoples, and how do you address, increasing the number of Indigenous role models that are in media, or that the stories that are covered in media that show, resilience and passion and pride for culture for Indigenous youth?
I want to ask Duncan to start us off on this, because Duncan did a Facebook Live just this afternoon on Indigenous issues, and got a fair number of questions in a short period of time. But how would you deal with that one?
That's why I got into this business. I didn't see people that looked like the people in my community on television. Jesse on the Beachcombers. That was the only real Indian that I ever saw on TV, and so that's in part. And when you go into isolated First Nation communities or urban Indigenous communities like Winnipeg, the TV's always on, and I didn't see myself, and so that's why I got into this business. And there are more and more of us getting into this business now. And so when I look at the second part of your question was, how do you present positive role models and stories of resilience? I like to think that the creation of CBC Indigenous about 3 years ago now has done a huge service to the network and also to Canada in terms of presenting a more holistic picture, not just the tragedies and the crisis and the us versus them conflict that we have seen over and over and over in media for over a century now. But we're starting to see more holistic pictures, and we're starting to see the lady that opened up the Bannock restaurant in Regina, and we're starting to see the Pee-wee all-girls hockey team from northern Manitoba that won a trophy. Those are important stories to tell, so that all Canadians see that life in First Nation communities is not just nasty, brutish, and short. But I will say this one thing also, that those stories about crisis and tragedy are also important to tell. We shouldn't just be leaning over and overcorrecting and just telling positive stories about happy-go-lucky Indians, because there are some really critical issues that this country needs to face, and journalists are there to shine light in dark places. And so we need to go to those communities and often ask stories about financial accountability, for example, about sexual assault, sexual violence. Those stories need to be told as well. The trick is having a holistic picture and having the good and the bad.
I've got a question here that just came in online that's not directly related to the focus of yours, but it is indirectly related to the issue. Why don't you try it? Raphael Bendahan asks this question. How do you become sensitive to, excuse me just a sec? What are you trying to tell me? Okay, I will ignore it. Okay. Here's the question, Raphael Bendahan. We just had some crosstalk going on there. How do you become sensitive to minorities who have less privilege and educational opportunities than most of the people who are reporting on them?
That's a really, really good question, and it's certainly one that we've as you know, we've grappled with at the CBC, and we've talked about quite a bit. And there are two ways I would think about this: is one through the reporting, but also one through who's reporting. So on the second level, I think the CBC. I mean, for example, I'm involved in a mentorship program at the CBC where we try to encourage people of all backgrounds, but certainly those of underrepresented communities in Canada, to become stronger voices, to do more at the CBC. So a number of people at the CBC of all kinds of backgrounds are mentoring younger journalists to try to get those voices, to make them stronger and to build their confidence and make them a bigger part of the CBC. So there's that. Then there's the reporting part of it. And it goes back to what voices do you include in a story? Well, I mean, what we were talking about earlier about balance, I mean, in the international context, and I think it works here as well, the idea is to get to that person who doesn't normally get their voice on. To me, the ones who are fighting, the ones who are politicians, all those guys get lots of airtime. It's always the little guy. It's always the person who doesn't get to the table, who doesn't get to the microphone, doesn't know how to get to the microphone, are the people that I want to hear from. So you go all the way to the back end of the room, and you find that quiet person who doesn't rush up to the stage, and you say, what do you think? And so that's, as a reporter, that I think is part of my job.
I want to show you another clip. This is from one of Paul's items, and it addresses this issue of trying to find the people we don't normally talk to who are becoming part of the bigger story that we're trying to tell, and we haven't got to them. We haven't talked to them to try and understand something that's happening. This happened in the U.S. election campaign last year, where Paul went hunting a particular group of Trump supporters. Watch this.
The head of the pack makes it through the light. The pack makes it through the light. Don't get split up.
Stop. Keep it going.
Back at Kool-Aid's bike shop, it's the day before the South Carolina primary. And they're getting set for that ride. These bikers are as authentic as it comes. Engaged voters who represent a new political force in America, one that old-school politicians can ignore at their peril. They ride for a candidate who speaks to an America that believes it has gone unheard until now.
Yeah! Woo!
Oh, yeah!
Gathering eventually at the local Trump headquarters, hoping for another glimpse of their guy. And as ever,
Thank you, Donald!
Trump, when he arrives for meetings, does not disappoint.
Thank you. You got to vote tomorrow, everybody. Right on. You're in. You're in. Make America great again. Amen. Trump, 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 Trump. The bikers, man. Amen.
Leaving the bikers already impressed, pumped, and ready for more.
Build that wall. Build that wall. Build that wall.
Something tells me he probably wishes he could go back to that day after the days he's had recently. But tell us about the decision to go after the bikers for Trump.
We were sort of scared out of our pants that day, man. We thought we were going to get beat up, but they were the nicest people, right? But that story began with the same kind of thinking that Nala was talking about, which is, on one level, TV news ain't rocket science. You could walk on a Capitol Hill or Parliament Hill or downtown Toronto, just aim the camera at people and who are in power and who have money and who have access to getting their voice out. That's easy, and it's a lot harder, and I argue, and I think we're all on the same page here, much more valuable to go and talk to other people. And so at the time, that was obviously during the campaign, we thought, well, who are these people that are voting for Trump, and why are they? And we thought we'd get, kind of frothing at the mouth crazy people, because that the brand was. I mean, we saw a lot of that at rallies, but man, they were thoughtful. And I'm sorry that there wasn't a clip in there because they had reasoned cases to make about what they liked about this guy. And this is all separate, by the way, from how things have worked out in the White House now. But at the time, it was interesting, right? Because this is a great crowd of Americans. Those guys told us they had never voted before, but something was making them want to vote now because the lesson was they were so fed up with politics of the last multiple generations that had done nothing for them. And so what do we take away from this now? Well, they're still there. 60 million people plus voted for Trump, right? Because they're fed up with the status quo. And even though the White House is on fire, they're still there. And the things we learned from them are still legitimate. And we learned that because we sought them out. Because instead of just going on to Capitol Hill and interviewing guys in suits, we went out to find the bikers for Trump, and man, were they interesting. And, I came away from that still thinking, but he won't win. There's not enough of them. But all these people who never voted before said, I think it's time. And he threaded the needle, and we saw what happened on election night, so it was instructive. But those are voices that we don't normally hear and that we ought to hear more of all the time, no matter your political stripe, I think.
All right, question in the audience?
Yes, good evening. I was wondering about how social media is impacting you. I follow a lot of you on Twitter, and many of you are very active on Twitter, but you're getting a lot of immediate feedback. And I try to read through some of the comments, and there's wide sways both ways. How does that impact your stories and how you guys operate? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a good question, a question of our times. Some of us sort of dip in and out of Twitter because it gets kind of hot at times. But let's try a couple. Diana, why don't you start, and then Rosie, who's Miss Twitter.
I'm a fan of Twitter. My family certainly thinks I'm too much on the phone. But I find it a very useful tool because it's a way for me to immediately engage with people who are consuming the news and hear what they think about it. What are we missing? What are we spending too much time on? What are we, doing wrong in people's views? So it's a very immediate, quick way to hear from people, more than I've ever experienced in my time as a journalist. Because prior to that, someone could maybe leave you a voicemail or write you a letter, but people talk themselves out of that all the time. They have that motion of really feeling strongly about something and think, I'm going to write, and then the next day they're like, no, I'm not going to do that. But with Twitter and other forms of social media, they can get to you right away. To that end, I find it incredibly useful and informative. I get tips, I get a sense of who's interested, who I might even want to talk to in subsequent stories, because investigative journalism is often you stay on one story for a while. So for me, it's a very useful tool. When it comes to the really polarized opinions, the trolls, I don't engage with them. I'm not going to engage when someone who's going to, start yelling at me in a shopping mall either. If you want to have a reasonable discussion, even if you want to tell me you don't like something I've done, I'm cool with that. But the really personal, hateful, just trying to goad me into something is just not worth my time as I see it. And I don't think it's really useful. People aren't, in that case, really looking for a debate. They're looking for a chance to try to shame you, call you out, do something to try to get you exercised or upset. And I think it's important to try to figure out where the line is for you when you engage. So, for me, social media has been a fairly positive experience, which isn't to say that I haven't experienced some of the roughest stuff out there. I just really don't play in that sandbox.
That was actually me in the shopping mall.
Was that you?
An aisle over. I want to know if you needed any help.
The glasses and the hair, that doesn't fool anybody, right?
Rosie?
Yell at me at the meet, and that's really important for me because it's hard for me sometimes to reach out and get outside of my studio and the construct of politics. So I find that really helpful when you tweet me things and ideas and thoughts, because then I sort of know where you're coming from. So I love it, even when I get yelled at.
Nola.
I'm an addict as well, and I used to work for a wire service, the Canadian Press, and so it really fulfills this need of mine to kind of have output all the time. So Twitter really suits my personality. But the one thing that I found it really useful for is actually the subject of this panel, which is the diversity of opinion, because it amplifies, as you all know. It's the smallest communities with opinions about certain things. It amplifies their voice. So when I write something that might be controversial, not only do I hear from the usual suspects, but I'm also hearing from that little guy I mentioned at the back of the room who says, you know what, my voice is just as equal, and I can also tweet at you and say, why did you forget about my point of view? So that to me is a really important point on social media. The other one is how it's changed the way we work, in that we are constantly outputting. There's always a tweet to send. There's always an Instagram to put out. There's always a Facebook Live. In fact, there wasn't the other day because we couldn't get to it during the French election. But there's extra stuff for us now to do. So it actually, in terms of the mechanics of how we work, it really has expanded the number of platforms we have to deliver to.
A couple of questions that have come in on social media. Dale Michael Carlson asks, should journalists state what political ideologies they support? And you could expand this. Should journalists have to declare what, if they have any, what shares they hold? What's their, stock portfolio? How far do you go in declaring what your, personal feelings or perhaps your personal holdings are, so an audience understands where you're coming from in telling a story? This is one, we all debate a lot over many years. in the business. And I wonder what feeling some of you might have. Duncan?
I don't tell anybody who I vote for, or if I vote at all. So I wouldn't feel any inclination to share it with my news audience. As far as as far as investments and things like that, that's what our JSP is about. I mean, we have journalistic standards of our own about declaring our own biases or conflicts. If we have a conflict with a story, then it's up to us to be responsible and declare that. So yeah, if I'm reporting on a copper mine that I happen to hold shares in, then I would feel responsible to let the audience know that anyway.
Anybody else want to?
I was just going to say, a colleague of ours, a friend of ours from a long time ago, Don Newman, took the position that journalists shouldn't vote. And he felt very strongly about that. And I certainly understood the position. I understood what he was trying to get at. And he felt, in particular, because of his role in Ottawa, that he felt that was a kind of a space he needed to create for himself. I think it's interesting as a journalist, I struggled with that earlier in my career. Was it okay to vote? Was I was it a form of unconscious bias to choose a candidate or a party? And I find as I've gotten older and more cynical maybe, that while I'm comfortable
When I first saw this product, I thought it looked kind of crazy. Didn't really understand what the benefits would be, but I had seen some before and after pictures on the website and thought to myself, you know what, I'm 48 years old, my face is starting to look a little bit aged, wouldn't hurt to try. So after 30 days, I could not believe my before and after picture. I literally rolled back the hands of time 10 years. And the best way I can explain this product is it's like something you've never experienced. You have about